Chapter 2182. Inside the main hall, Dan Yi, Ian Jing, Fu Qingming, and Taoist 1K were sitting together, observing the situation in the lower realms. Now, many worlds had their doors forcefully opened, and cultivators kept pouring in from the outside. As soon as these people appeared, they massacred the living beings and took the initiative to attack the local cultivators. Some of the more powerful cultivators released their magic power without restraint, collapsing continents and cracking the earth and stars. It seemed that they had come purely for the sake of destruction. Danny said, "Just now, I received a message from the Supreme. He told me that the enemies are from beyond Busu heaven, and because of the conflict of Tao, they came to kill our cultivators." Michihito Ichido sneered, "How do you want to deal with these cultivators? Do you need to use a spell to get rid of them?" As long as they weren't true young cultivators, he could erase them with a single thought. Fu Qingming shook his head, "Don't worry about it. If we can't even deal with these people, how can we talk about cultivation?" Dan Yi's tone became more serious. "We can ignore these cultivators, but they definitely have more tricks up their sleeves. There must be people on par with us, Whaley. We need to be careful." Fu Qingming and Michihito Ichido both nodded. Taoist 1K was expressionless. Just as they were talking, they suddenly saw two people step out from the door. They first looked around, then looked in their direction. Dan Yi, Fu Qingming, and Michihito Ichido couldn't help but become serious. These two were undoubtedly true young cultivators, and although only two of them had appeared, it was likely that there would be more of them coming. However, these two people gave them a strange feeling. They clearly looked like they were in the third realm, but their auras were not much stronger than theirs, as if they had just entered the true yang realm. In reality, these two cultivators were forcibly promoted by Yao Han and Ji Zhuang using the Whaley. But because of the collision of the two realms' Whaley, only the two of them could pass through the gap. But even if they were killed, as long as Yao Han and Ji Zhuang were still alive, they could continue to send people over. Michihito Ichido said, "These two are stronger than me, so they won't be easy to deal with. Why don't we each bring our Tao treasures and go up?" Taoist 1K never said much when they gathered in the past, but now he said, "Let me deal with them." After saying that, he stood up and walked towards the two people. This time, the Mirror Lake cultivators attacked on a large scale without asking who their opponents were. They only knew that all living beings and cultivators in Busu heaven were their opponents. So it was not only the human Tao realm that was being attacked, even the heavenly demon realm was also being attacked. However, because they couldn't see the situation and didn't know where these cultivators came from, Ling Jiang, Qi Yao, Deng Zhang, Bai Wei, and the others watched coldly from the sidelines. They let the people below fight and didn't respond. In the Yen sect's headquarters, Gao Qingtu sat on the altar and was reading the urgent reports from the branches of the realms. At this moment, almost every realm where the Yen sect existed was attacked. Other than the Luo sect members that he had met in the past, there was also a sect that called themselves the Virtue sect. These people from the foreign sect did not blindly kill the Yen sect's Taoists, but through chanting, they forced them to worship the demon god, causing them to change their Tao. He immediately realized that this was a battle between sections. In fact, these two sects didn't have any special figures, but they had the help of the cultivators from outside the sections. Yen's sect was resisting with their own strength now, so it was difficult to deal with them. He immediately invited all the protectors and said, "Reports from all the realms said that all the places where the Yen sect exists, regardless of whether they are strong or weak, have been attacked. I think it's disadvantageous to fight with force, so I can order the elders of all realms to lead their disciples to retreat to the four major constellations. What do you think, protectors?" He thought that it was impossible to resist with the Yen sect's strength alone. Instead, it would make the other party's strength stronger and stronger, so they could only retreat to the four major constellations of Yuanzun. In this way, they could rely on the mighty people and various sections. Even if a strong enemy came, they could also ask for help from outside. If it really didn't work, they could also gather everyone into the headquarters. There was the protection of the ancestral teaching stone tablet here, so it was difficult for those who had not practiced the Yen sect's Tao to enter. At the same time, this was also an opportunity to integrate the Yen sect. Most of the protectors below had no objections. Seeing this, Gao Qingtu was about to announce the order. At this moment, he glanced to the side and saw that Tang Yu, who was sitting below, wanted to say something but hesitated. His heart moved slightly, so he found an excuse and turned to the back hall. After a while, Tang Yu came in from somewhere else, bowed and said, "Teacher." Gao Qingtu asked, "Just now, you seem to have something to say. Is there something that's inconvenient to say in the hall?" Tang Yu cupped his hands and said, "Teacher, I have something to say." Gao Qingtu said, "Say it." Tang Yu said, "I think that our Yen sect can only rely on ourselves in such a dangerous situation. We would rather hide in the headquarters in the end than seek help from those outside the sect. Otherwise, these people will use this as a threat in the future, and it will be disadvantageous to our Yen sect's teaching." Gao Qingtu pondered deeply for a long time and said, "What you said is reasonable. I was negligent in this matter. Our Yen sect doesn't need to rely on those outside the sect. The enemy is powerful, so we can just retreat for now." In order to avoid conflict with the various sects, the Yen sect had always avoided them. They didn't disturb them, nor did they get too close. Because they didn't have any friendship with these sects in the past, if they really encountered the danger of destruction, they might not help sincerely. On the contrary, if they safely passed through the crisis, as long as there were external path cultivators involved, it would be a favor no matter how useful they were. Rather than that, it would be better to directly retreat to the headquarters to protect it. Not only could they increase their strength, but they could also avoid damage. In the silence, Yao Han and Ji Zhuang saw that although their Yen sect's teaching had settled down in Busushan, the spread of the Yen sect's teaching had also exceeded their expectations. Although the offensive was fierce, they didn't know when the Yen sect would be completely wiped out. Moreover, they didn't know when Zhang Yan would return. At this time, Ancestor Yao Han silently calculated and found that Busushan's Weili showed signs of wavering. It seemed like there was an opportunity to take advantage of, so he said, "Friend, why don't you call all the other friends to come and attack together?" Jizhuang Daoren nodded. The best way was to open a gap from the front and directly snatch Busushan down, then expel Zhang Yan's Weili. That would solve everything. With a thought, he called out Xian Che, Towering Sky, Yu Qiu, Yu Lu, and the others to come out to help. Yu Qiu and Yu Lu were originally on the same side as Ancestor Yao Han, so they naturally didn't have any objections. They immediately left the Mirror Lake and used their Weili to attack Busushan together. Towering Sky, Xian Che, and Rindu also came out at this time. However, although they looked normal on the surface, they were extremely unwilling in their hearts. They knew Zhang Yan's ability. It would be fine if they could really stop him this time, but if they didn't succeed, once he returned, the enmity of obstructing his path would definitely not be easily resolved. However, under the pressure of Yao Han and Ji Zhuang, they couldn't escape, so they could only release their Weili to attack Busushan together. Inside Bu Shutian, Xin Chang, Zhan Yuan, and the others had been on guard. When they saw the young man move, they immediately used their power to block the young man's attack. It was hard to tell who would win or lose. After this stalemate for a long time, Ji Zhuang and Yao Han suddenly felt a sense of danger approaching, and it came from an external source. They didn't need to think too much to know that this threat came from Zhang Yan. It seemed like he would return soon. Yao Han and Ji Zhuang's expressions darkened. With the current situation, it seemed like they couldn't cut off Zhang Yan's foundation before he returned. Ancestor Yao Han suggested, "I heard from that Taoist just now that it would be difficult for Taoist Xian Yuan to return. With the current situation, why don't we go and ask him again?" Ji Zhuang also felt that this was reasonable, so he went with Yao Han to the place where the Taoist was located. He bowed and asked, "Is Taoist Xian Yuan here?" The Taoist's figure appeared and said, "What do you two want?" Ji Zhuang said that Taoist Xian Yuan is about to return, and it is difficult for us to stop him. I have come to ask for your guidance. The Taoist calculated for a while and smiled. "No wonder you two can't succeed, this person has other plans. However, this person doesn't have creation Pauline, so he won't be able to do anything. When the time is right, I will naturally disturb his foundation and prevent him from returning. Don't worry." When Yao Han and Ji Zhuang heard this, They didn't ask any more questions. They bowed and went back to urge the others to speed up their attacks. At this moment, Zhang Yan was still walking beside the dazzling river of stars. He was walking towards the way, and the way was emotionless. The higher he went, the more he broke away from everything in the present world. As he went higher, countless truths of the way became known to him out of thin air. At this moment he vaguely saw something. When he looked down, he could immediately tell that this was the essence of the creation before it shattered. Because it belonged to the Tao, he could see it now. However, when he wanted to see more clearly, he found that he was blocked by a force that prevented him from asking about the secrets of this place. This force didn't come from one place, but from many entangled forces. A strange look appeared in his eyes. Even though he couldn't see much, he had come here after all, and he could vaguely see some strange phenomena. When he was about to take a closer look, he suddenly found that he was pushed by a force and flowed up the galaxy. With a thought, he immediately knew that it was because he couldn't see clearly with his current strength, and it was very easy to obtain power here. He just had to walk towards the source of the Tao, and the higher he went, the stronger the power he obtained. So, when he wanted to understand the truth of this place, he couldn't help but go to the source. But if he didn't find the limit of his Tao and kept going up, then he would be trapped here and coexist with the Tao, and he would never be able to return to the universal. When he thought of this, he didn't force it and continued to search for the limit of his Tao. But at this moment, he raised his head and saw a Taoist walking in front of him. The Taoist's back was both familiar and unfamiliar. The Tao here was unrestrained, and he guessed the Taoist's origin with a thought. But as soon as he thought of this, the Taoist's figure disappeared, but the galaxy of the Tao became much brighter for no reason. Chapter 2183. Zhang Yan walked to the edge of the Great Path Galaxy. Just now, what he saw was the manifestation of his own path. Because he wanted to find the limit of the Great Path as soon as possible, the path would naturally guide him. Now, as long as he walked into this part of the Great Path Galaxy, he would reach the limit of his own Great Path. However, although everyone's cultivation method had its limit, it did not mean that one could only go this far. This was just following one's own wishes, and the path automatically gave the safest choice. If one was more conservative, then one could not go any further and would need to turn back. But one's gains would stop here. After all, only by going further could one obtain more power. From the thought transmitted by the Great Being, he could actually still go forward. Because if one were to disregard the state of mind, pure Tao techniques were extremely inflexible. What was revealed now was merely his bottom line, but it didn't mean that there was no room for improvement. Thus, he didn't stop because of this. In fact, he was very different from the other cultivators who came here. These people all came here with the help of Creation Pauline. They received the help of Pauline's power, but at the same time, they would be restricted by Pauline's power. When this person was about to stop sensing Pauline, even if one thought they could still go forward, they had to go back. Otherwise, there was a high chance that they would be lost here. He did not know where the great virtues of the past had stopped, but it was not difficult to imagine that their ultimate limit here was dependent on Creation Pauline. However, this led them back to the previous problem. The lotus of good fortune wasn't their own item, so they weren't compatible with each other. The power of the lotus couldn't be used to its fullest, so the place it stopped at might not be the true limit of what it could reach. And he was entrusted by Bu Shutian to come here. The foundation of the world was the body of strength. This was originally him, so he could completely reach the limit he could feel. Now, he felt that the connection between him and the body of strength path was still very strong. This could support him as he continued to advance towards the source of the Great Path Galaxy. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly stopped because the feeling of being connected had weakened for no reason, and it had become faintly discernible. This feeling came extremely suddenly, and the feeling in his heart told him that he couldn't go any further at this moment. However, another thought told him that as long as he took another step forward, just a single step, he would be able to come into contact with everything he needed to know. It wouldn't be difficult for him to bring this back and use it to climb to the next realm. His gaze was indifferent, and he wasn't bewitched by this. When it was time to advance, he would advance, and when it was time to stop, he would stop. There were some things that he couldn't touch at the moment. If he were to forcefully peek at them, he would most likely be trapped here and unable to extricate himself. That body of strength was him. Since the connection was already weak, then it was the manifestation of his heart. There was no need to probe further. The limit of his great Tao was here. He tilted his head and looked at the great path galaxy. The starlight here was much sparser than before. This also meant that once he settled here, there wouldn't be many great Taos that could restrain him once he returned to the all-beings. Without any hesitation, he turned around and walked in. Not long after, his entire person was submerged in the great path galaxy. In Bushu heaven, facing the endless stream of cultivators from beyond the heavens, the cultivators outside the 4 major tribes were gradually unable to hold on. Fortunately, an order from the upper realm had arrived, and they used the realm gate to retreat into the 4 major tribes. As for the demons and the heartless cultivators, they were also affected at this moment. However, there were 6 demon masters, Bai Wei and Deng Zhang, keeping watch here. Just now, the Mirror Lake cultivators arrived in their territory and were wiped out by them. These cultivators from the Mirror Lake mainly wanted to deal with the followers of Yen's sect. However, they couldn't determine how many people there were in Yen's sect, and they couldn't distinguish if they were hiding in other sections. Moreover, they were told in their hearts that not a single Tao of Yen's sect could exist in the world. Therefore, they had to annihilate all the sects and living beings in Busha heaven. Finally, they had to pass on the Tao of Yen's sect to be considered successful. This seemed very difficult to accomplish, but as long as there was a true young cultivator from the Mirror Lake who survived until the end, it could be easily accomplished. Gao Qingtu tried his best to gather most of the followers of Yen's sect in the main altar. There was a Tao imparting stone tablet guarding the place, and outsiders who hadn't practiced the Tao of Yen's sect couldn't enter. However, he still secretly arranged for some people to stay in the remote and desolate world. The reason for this was that this method might not be foolproof. 4 cultivators with profound realms, it wouldn't be difficult for them to learn the Tao of Yen's sect in a short period of time as long as they asked about the Tao of Yen's sect once. On the other hand, cultivating the Tao of Yen's sect didn't cause others to believe in it. If this person were to charge in, then it might be a calamity. His worries weren't groundless. There were indeed many people that had chosen to do this, but the final outcome wasn't as he'd expected. There were indeed cultivators from the outside that had learned the Tao of Yen's sect, but as soon as they entered this world, they would face the Tao imparting stone tablet that represented the entire world. If they rejected this Tao art from the depths of their hearts, then they would naturally be rejected by the Tao imparting stone tablet. If they wanted to overcome it, then the only way was to truly acknowledge it. But if they were really able to accomplish this, then they would be completely considered as a Taoist of Yen's sect, and they would naturally not harm fellow Taoists. Yao Han and Ji Zhuang had always been watching the changes in Busha heaven from the outside. At this moment, it wasn't difficult for them to discern that the situation had undoubtedly fallen into a stalemate. They were unable to break through the defenses of Busha heaven from the outside, and the progress within was rather unsatisfactory as well. Although there was a slight possibility of success, they didn't know how long they would have to wait. From what they could sense just now, it was impossible to accomplish it before Zhang Yan returned. Fortunately, the Taoist seemed to be unwilling to see them return, and he even said that he had a way to deal with them. So at this moment, they didn't have the desire to forge ahead like before. It would be best if they could break through the defenses, but if they couldn't, then it was fine. They seemed to be much more slack than before. In fact, the fundamental reason for this was because they knew that even if they occupied Busha heaven, the greatest benefit here wouldn't be theirs. Previously it was for themselves, but now it was others who benefited, so there was no need to work so hard. Ancestor Yao Han said, "If that Taoist Xian Yuan doesn't return, how will fellow Taoist view him?" Taoist Ji Zhuang pondered for a moment before saying, "The moment this person appeared, he suppressed that existence, which is enough to show that he doesn't want to see all of you suffer and have the possibility of coexisting with us." Just now, fellow Taoists should have heard him say that among all beings, Taoist Xian Yuan's position wasn't mentioned, but he didn't mention us. Perhaps our original bodies had an agreement with him. Ancestor Yao Han nodded. With that person's power, if they really weren't accepted by him, then why would he say these words to them? He could just destroy him. But he was a deep thinker, and he didn't think that there was such a good thing as an agreement. Even if that was true, with only one person in power, why would he need to abide by it? If it was him, if he had all the power in his hands, would he let the other great beings return one by one? He would definitely find a way to cut off their return paths, and then enjoy everything for himself, slowly finding the supreme path. But right now, the other party had the absolute advantage. Even if he suspected that the other party had ulterior motives, he couldn't disobey, so he could only hope for the best. When Zhang Yan entered the Great Tao Galaxy, he allowed the Great Tao to restrain him again. However, compared to before, the restraint was much less. What he needed to do now was to return to Bu Su Tian, free from the restraints of the Great Tao. Once he returned to all beings, he could be called a virtuous person. What was a virtuous person? A virtuous person walked the path of the Great Tao. A virtuous person coexisted with the Great Tao. They could be considered a part of the Great Tao, but they weren't completely connected to it. It was just that the Great Tao was formless, while a virtuous person was a manifestation of the Great Tao in the world. So if you didn't return to all beings, you wouldn't be able to be called a virtuous person. Only by returning could you be considered complete. At this moment, he followed the guidance of the body of strength and landed in all beings. In the silence, the Taoist sitting in the land of creation seemed to sense something. He smiled and said, "How can I allow you to return?" He used a spell to lift creation Pauline up and split out a bit of power. In just an instant, just a bit of Wei Li leaked out, but it caused the countless realms behind him to disappear. It was as if they would never appear again. If this mighty force was allowed to come out, it could easily annihilate everything. Fortunately, he stopped in time and used the Lotus of Good Fortune to support the remaining force. Then, he controlled this portion of force to descend towards Bu Shutian. In just an instant, it had covered Zhang Yan's body of strength and the Taoist practitioners of Yen sect, the two foundations of establishing the world. He smiled faintly. Although this method couldn't stop them for too long as the person seeking the Great Tao couldn't return, he would be assimilated by the Great Tao. At that time, it would be useless even if he found the way back. Zhang Yan was on his way back when he suddenly felt his connection with the Great Tao being disturbed by a power. As a result, he gradually lost his connection with the Great Tao. Clearly, someone wanted to trap him in this place. However, did they think that he wouldn't be able to return just because they disturbed his connection with the Great Tao? To him, the Great Tao was not only the body of strength and the Taoist of evolution. There was another choice here. He focused his gaze and looked in one direction. The 9 continents. In the past, when he looked at this place, he always felt that it was extremely blurry. It seemed to exist but not exist, and it seemed to be empty but not empty. However, when he was immersed in the Great Tao Galaxy, it was extremely clear. It was probably because of the uniqueness of the 9 continents that the 4 patriarchs chose to place their orthodoxy here. Back then, he felt that the spiritual vigor of the 9 continents had been severed and the remaining living beings had no path of cultivation. Therefore, he left a clone there to pass on the Tao. The Tao here was also the foundation of his Great Tao. With this thought, the connection between him and the world suddenly became stronger, and no power could stop it. He smiled and chanted, "The myriad tribulations have passed the tribulation and entered the world. The ordinary has washed away the old stubbornness. The Tao is nameless and the God is autonomous. There is another person on the lotus platform." After chanting, he broke through the barrier between being and nothingness and fell into the ordinary. Chapter 2184. Yao Han and Ji Zhuang stood in the void. At this moment, they were still urging their people and the spirit refinement cultivators to attack Bu Su Tian. Just now, with the Taoist spell, the feeling that Zhang Yan could return at any time disappeared. Therefore, they thought that he was trapped in the Great Tao, and they could easily clean up the mess. Ancestor Yao Han said that Taoists sent out a portion of the Wei Li to cover up Zhang Yan's foundation. It caused quite a commotion, and even a part of it collapsed. I'm sure the people in Bushu can sense it. Why don't we send someone to persuade them to stop? That way, we can settle this matter as soon as possible. In reality, if Zhang Yan really couldn't return, he would force those who opposed him in Bushu into eternal silence. Just now would be the best result. However, he still felt a little uneasy. To avoid any unexpected changes, it was better to occupy Bushu as soon as possible. Jizhuang Daoren nodded. The spirit refinement cultivators in Bushu were also there because of the threat of that existence. They might not be of one mind with Zhang Yan. Now that Zhang Yan couldn't return, and that existence was being suppressed by the Taoist, what reason did this generation have to fight them to the end? He immediately changed his mind, and a blurry figure appeared. He said, "Go and tell them that Taoist Xianyuan has already contracted the great Tao and can't return. I don't need them to do anything. Just hold back some of your magic power and let me attack Bushu. I won't make things difficult for them after that." The figure bowed and went through the gap that Bushu had created. However, when it reached there, it was hit by the Weili on both sides and immediately shattered. However, a strand of consciousness was transmitted. At the same time, Xinchang, Zhai Yuan, Qing Sheng, and the others all felt this strand of consciousness. Their expressions changed slightly. If Zhang Yan really couldn't return, then there was no point in them persisting. Xinchang Taoist looked at everyone and said, "What do you think?" Zhai Yuan pondered for a moment and said, "This is just messing with my mind. I suggest we ignore it." Chen Shu also said, "I also think we should ignore it." She occupied a land of fortune all by herself. If the people of Mirror Lake attacked, then this land might change owners, so she didn't want to give up resisting. Qing Sheng sneered and said, "Taoist Xuanyuan's avatar is still here. Otherwise, Bushu would have fallen long ago. I don't believe that he has fallen into the great Tao. Even if it is true, why should I hand over Bushu to someone else?" Taoist Xinchang looked at Boy Xinchang and asked, "What about you?" Boy Chang shook his head and said, "It's fake, it's fake." Xinchang Taoist nodded and looked at Quan Taoist and Qian Taoist. "What do you two think?" Fang and Bing Kong and Luo Xian Taoist wanted to say. Tian Sheng Luo Tian Fang and Luo Fang and Bing Kong looked Luo how Tian can Tian Luo even without Tian, he can still can do Tian can do. Even without our help, he can still defend it. Bing Kong said, "That consciousness said that there is a Vedanta outside and we have no chance of winning. If he is really so powerful, why would he need to secretly persuade me?" In fact, the main reason why no one had any objections was that Zhang Yan had treated them well in Bushu. Moreover, Zhang Yan's avatar was still the master of this land. Even if he couldn't stop the outsiders, it was still easy for him to take them down. Ji Zhuang saw that there was no reply from Bushu for a long time, and the defense did not weaken at all. He knew that Xinchang and the others were not willing to give up. He said expressionlessly, "Since they are so stubborn, then when we break through Bushu, we will send them to eternal silence." Ancestor Yao Han chuckled and was about to say something when he felt that something was wrong. The realms around him flickered like candles in the wind and could be extinguished at any moment. Places of fortune like Bushu and Mirror Lake also became distorted as if they would collapse at any moment. Not only that, he felt that the creation Pauline in his hand was trembling nonstop. The two looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. The destruction of all things and the collapse of all things was a sign of the Vedanta's return. At this moment, the Taoist was sitting peacefully in the land of fortune, and his calm expression suddenly changed drastically. He had clearly sensed something, and he looked towards a certain direction, saying, "How is this possible?" Xian Che, towering firmament, and the others who were attacking Bushu were shocked and stopped their attacks when they sensed the strange phenomenon. Inside Bushu, Xinchang, Zhan Yuan, Qing Sheng, and the others did the same. They stood up and looked up. Through the divine wills of the crowd, they could sense that above the void, there was an indistinct spot where a boundless majestic force was born out of nowhere. This mighty force instantly transformed into surging profound energy, and then a ray of spiritual light that was filled with the silence of the void suddenly appeared. Amidst the rumbling, a black-robed Taoist with fluttering sleeves and 5 rays of light on his back had already broken through the silence and returned to the world. Zhang Yan's eyes swept around. As he returned, the realms around him trembled and the remnants of the Whaley collapsed. It looked like they could turn into nothingness at any moment. The return of the Vedanta could be said to have created something out of nothing. A boundless Whaley suddenly appeared in the void, and it was enough to destroy all things and return them to nothingness. However, the Vedanta usually had creation Pauline as a support, so they could place this power within it and slowly dissolve it. Although Zhang Yan didn't have creation Pauline with him, this power must be restrained. Therefore, with a thought, the strength path body had already gathered with him. The two bodies merged together and there was no need to place any support. Naturally, the Whaley was restrained and the destructive force was also stopped. When the Whaley retreated, all the spirit refinement cultivators revealed a lingering fear. Just now, they felt as if they were going to disappear along with the Whaley. If that happened, everyone would be banished into eternal silence. Zhang Yan turned his gaze and looked directly at the Taoist. Since he had returned successfully, the karma that obstructed his path should be resolved first. At this moment, the Taoist had recovered his calm and composed appearance from before. He slowly raised his hand and cupped his hands towards Zhang Yan as he said, "Fellow Taoist, since you've returned, you should understand that if we get into an argument, then it'll be difficult for everything to exist. At that time, if that existence is no longer restrained, it will also be able to escape. But if we don't move, it will be more advantageous. Why don't we not disturb each other in the future and cultivate our own Tao? What do you think?" Zhang Yan smiled faintly. When two Vedanta fought, the Whaley could easily destroy all things. If all things didn't exist, then nothing would exist. Perhaps a realm like Bu Su Tian could avoid it, but the fragments of creation and the land of creation would also disappear. Unless all things could be restored, they would appear again. However, this matter was even more complicated and difficult. If he could avoid it, he wouldn't want to do so. However, there was a precondition. In a situation where both sides were equal in strength, this person had overestimated himself. He looked down and didn't say anything. He reached down and grabbed. At this moment, in the senses of all the spirit refinement cultivators, a giant hand that could topple the world pressed down and shrouded all things. There was nowhere to escape and nowhere to hide. The Taoist's expression changed. He didn't expect Zhang Yan to not care about the consequences. He naturally wouldn't wait for death. He released the Whaley on his body, and a golden light rose. The two forces were about to collide and the world was about to be destroyed. However, when the hand fell, the mighty force that the Taoist released seemed to have gone from existence to nothingness and actually retreated bit by bit. The reason why Zhang Yan dared to make a move was because he didn't achieve it with Pauline's power. He was not bound by the great Tao. Although he had achieved great virtue just now, the Whaley was far better than this person. He could easily dissolve the force of the collision between the two with the power of nothing. The Taoist didn't seem to have expected such a situation. When faced with Zhang Yan's attack, he actually didn't have the slightest ability to resist, and he could only watch helplessly as his mighty force was slowly forced back. In the end, it would naturally transform into nothingness and cease to exist above everything. He had calculated countless times and knew that this was Zhang Yan's absolute suppression. He couldn't break free. The moment the latter made a move, the ending was already decided. He looked up at Zhang Yan and said loudly, "Fellow Taoist, do you know why all of us are bound by Pauline?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Why?" The Taoist said, "All things are immeasurable and all things are endless. However, in the eyes of those of us who can distinguish between existence and non-existence, it has its own fixed number. Therefore, we use Pauline as the limit. Creation Pauline is the sustenance of the cycle of all things. If it is gathered, the existence and non-existence will be reversed and something will be created out of nothing. You don't use Pauline to steal the great Tao. When you achieve Tao, you take more power, then you will have less power elsewhere. From then on, You have lost the balance of heaven. The collapse of all things will start from you. Zhang Yan smiled in the face of his accusation. The great virtue Weili was limited by Pauline. Was it because they were willing to do so and didn't want to get more? It was not like that. It was just because they didn't have a way to get more. Moreover, he had already achieved the third realm and was part of the great virtue. He was a part of the great Tao, so he could see things that others couldn't. He said, "You keep saying that you are from our generation, but you are not a great virtue. How do you know what great virtue is thinking? How do you know what the heavens Tao is?" The Taoist was stunned and said, "I am not a great virtue?" Zhang Yan looked at him and said, "What is your name and where did you come from? I'm afraid even you don't know." The Taoist's eyes were lost for a moment, then he was shocked. It was as if the heaven's secret that was originally blinded was broken. He suddenly looked at Zhang Yan and seemed like he wanted to say something. However, at this moment, the mana on his body suddenly collapsed. Before Zhang Yan's Weili could completely suppress it, it turned into nothingness and returned to nothing. Not even a bit of the Weili was left. As for the Pauline in his hand, it also scattered for no reason. Zhang Yan's eyes were deep. From the qi dynamic of the Weili, the other party's source came from a great virtue. However, it was controlled by a certain kind of power. As for where this power came from, he had some guesses when he saw the blurry images. However, now was not the time to investigate. He looked at the other side. Just now, without the Taoist suppression, the existence's qi dynamic was already flourishing. If he didn't find a way to stop it, he would probably return soon. Chapter 2185. Zhang Yan could tell from the aura that the person behind the will was different from the Taoist who had dispersed. He was a genuine Vedanta. Through the layers of obstacles, it was not difficult for him to see that due to some kind of help, the person would definitely be able to return. With his current ability, it was possible to say that he could suppress it. Just like the Taoist just now, even if he was not a Vedanta, he could stop him with the help of a portion of Pauline Weili. But why did he have to do this? Instead of continuing to delay, it was better to resolve this matter as soon as possible. Now that he was also a Vedanta, he naturally did not fear this person. But there was a prerequisite that when the other party returned, he could not overturn everything. It was just that if it was only the Vedanta's own Weili that was pressing down, it would be fine as he could directly resolve it. But there was also the karmic tribulation power that could shatter the essence of creation. With the two combined, it would not be so easy to deal with. He thought for a moment, and with a wave of his hand, a Pauline flower appeared in his hand. This was the Pauline left behind by the owner of the will. Previously, he had tried to find the whereabouts of this thing, but at that time his cultivation was low, it would probably take a lot of effort to find it. Moreover, he had other ways to enter the third stage, so he temporarily put the matter aside. But after becoming a Vedanta, with the help of the lotus petal in the divine decree and the aura left behind by the owner of the will, he easily found the location of this thing. He was not like Yao Han, Ji Zhuang, and the others. He was only a part of the power of a Vedanta, and the lotus he used also only had a portion of the power of Pauline. The power of Pauline that he summoned back at this moment was complete. It was not difficult to use this thing to entrust the tribulation power. Even if there was a little leakage, he could use the Weili to block it. Because at this moment, there was no Weili to restrain the form of the will, the latter was released, and its aura climbed all the way up. With a rumble, it instantly entered the third stage. Then, a wave of power began to affect the entire world. Just now, after everything had almost collapsed, this kind of momentum appeared again. When Zhang Yan and the Taoist were fighting, Yao Han and Ji Zhuang knew that the situation was lost, so they led everyone back into the mirror lake. Then, the two of them hid somewhere and secretly discussed something. Can Shao, Xian Che, and the others returned to their original camp, but they were a little uneasy. They had previously participated in the matter of blocking Zhang Yan's path, but the latter just happened to return after achieving his Tao. If he came to find trouble with them later, what could they use to resist a Vedanta? Thus, when Zhang Yan fought that Taoist earlier, they hoped that the latter would be able to defeat him. However, the outcome caused them to be greatly disappointed. It was even to the extent that they were unable to discern exactly what had happened. All they knew was that the Taoist had inexplicably vanished, and it seemed as if he hadn't brought any trouble to Zhang Yan. But now, when they saw that Zhang Yan did not suppress that existence like the Taoist, and instead allowed the Weili to rise, they were all shocked. For a long time, that existence had always been above everyone's heads. In the silence, all spirit refinement cultivators were afraid of the Weili, afraid that he would return. They did not expect that Zhang Yan would actually let him do as he pleased. That person had already achieved Vedanta, so perhaps he was not afraid of anything, but they were afraid that they would be devoured by that existence along with Zhu Yu. Ren Du said in fear, What is Taoist Xin Yuan trying to do? Is he going to let Zhu Yu die? Ken Shao, who was still somewhat clear-headed, said, It can't be like that. Otherwise, Taoist Xin Yuan would let this happen as soon as he returned just now. Compared to this, he was more worried that Zhang Yan would continue to deal with them after dealing with this matter. Facing a Vedanta, they had nowhere to run. Even if they hid in the Mirror Lake, they would not necessarily be safe. The only people they could count on now were Ji Zhuang and Yao Han. At this moment, they should be more worried about this matter than they were. They could only wait and see if they could find a solution. Inside Bu Su Tian, Shin Chang, Zhan Yuan, and the others felt a little uneasy when they saw that existence's qi activity skyrocketing. Taoist Zhan Yuan said worriedly, Taoist Xin Yuan, are you doing this to fight with that person? But I'm afraid that Zhu Yu and Wan Shi will be implicated. Taoist Shun Chang thought for a while and said, Taoist Xin Yuan, you should be aware of this, so you don't have to worry about this. Taoist Qing Xing sneered and said, We are in Bu Su Tian. Even if everything is overturned, it will not happen here. Wan Fang and Bing Kong looked at each other, but they were calm and unworried. On the one hand, as Qing Xing had said, even if everything was destroyed, Bu Su Tian, a place where the essence of creation condensed, would not be affected. Also, with the power of Vedanta, if Zhang Yan had such thoughts, he could just let go of his Weili, and there would be no need to go through so much trouble. Therefore, they thought that nothing would happen to them. At this moment, Zhang Yan was looking at the transformation of the embodiment of will. Under his gaze, it did not take long for the embodiment of will to reach the third stage without any obstruction. However, his figure and face were still unusually blurry. This was because only the great virtue's mighty power had returned early, and the karma of the calamity power that destroyed the essence of creation was still present. Therefore, the great virtue behind it would only truly enter the world of all beings after the manifestation of the will had completed the step of overturning all beings. In other words, it was only the Vedanta Weili that appeared at this moment, and not the Vedanta himself. Even so, the power of the two was not the slightest bit different. The embodiment of the Weili looked at Zhang Yan, but did not make any hostile moves. This was because, in his eyes, Zhang Yan was a part of the great Tao, and had long transcended the world of all beings. Therefore, he was not a target that he wanted to deal with. At this moment, the embodiment suddenly inhaled into the void, and the world shook incessantly. If it was not stopped, it would soon return to nirvana. At this moment, Zhang Yan threw the Pauline in his hand. It flew down and emitted rays of treasure light. In an instant, it stopped the power that could destroy everything, and the embodiment's actions were immediately interrupted. The embodiment of the Weili suddenly turned around and stared at Zhang Yan. All the Weili that seemed to be able to devour everything instantly pressed down. It was formed by the embodiment of will, which could also be called an obsession. Therefore, when facing an existence that was stronger than the Weili, it would not have any fear, nor would it care about compromise or retreat. Zhang Yan's figure did not move, but suddenly, a five-colored brilliance appeared behind him. In an instant, it filled the void and covered the world. As the five-colored brilliance intersected, there was the sound of clashing swords. The embodiment of the Weili was instantly devoured by the five-colored brilliance and disappeared. Then, with a turn of his will, countless sword lights flew out. Every sword light evolved into a different great Tao. Under the illumination of the sword lights, the original figure of the embodiment of the Weili dimmed a little. If it was said that when Zhang Yan was dealing with the Taoist just now, he was using the Tao to subdue the enemy. As a great virtue, he was the manifestation of the great Tao in the world. Although the other party was also at the same level as him, it was only an embodiment of the Weili and did not understand the Tao. How could it compete with him in the Tao? The embodiment of the Weili used countless methods, but no matter how much the Weili vented, it could not break through the five-colored brilliance. As a result, none of it fell into the world. As for the embodiment of the great Tao, it became weaker and weaker under the slashes of the sword lights that contained the great Tao. At this moment, Zhang Yan pointed with a finger. With a loud bang, the embodiment of the Weili shattered. Then, he did not do anything else and only looked at the scene quietly. After the Weili dispersed, it seemed to have lost its support and slowly dispersed. However, at the moment when the last wisp of the Weili disappeared, there was suddenly something out of nothing, and a spiritual light was born from within. When the light dispersed, a Taoist walked out. He waved his hand, and the creation Pauline, who was originally excited, stopped moving and flew straight into his palm. At this moment, he also saw Zhang Yan and couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. After a little calculation, he had a rough idea in his heart. He held the lotus and bowed, saying, "Greetings, Taoist friend." Zhang Yan bowed back and said, "Taoist friend, how should I address you?" The Taoist said, "The supernatural power of Dharma transformation needs to be shrewd, and the Tao is formless, I Wei Ming." At this moment, he bowed again. "If it wasn't for Taoist friend, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to return, so I have to thank you." Zhang Yan said, "There's no need to thank me for this, but I have a question. If Taoist friend comes back, everything will be overturned, and everything will be gone, so what's the point of coming back?" Wei Ming said, "Even if the worst result is, at least Butian and this place will not be destroyed. If we can use this place to receive Taoist friends back, then with everyone's creation Pauline, we can use the power of the great Tao to reappear." At this moment, Zhang Yan seemed to have heard something and said, "The worst result is that Taoist friend originally had Butian, so everything will not perish because of this?" Wei Ming didn't answer immediately, but instead said, "Do you know why the form that I entrust my thoughts to changes with the cultivation of the people in the world?" Zhang Yan, "Why is that?" Wei Ming said, "Before the essence of creation was broken, we had already expected the result of failure. At that time, we would have to bear the power of karma, and we would no longer be able to change into nothing and return to everything. Thus, we had to discuss a way out. However, the Weili can be entrusted, but it's hard to escape the fruit of karma, so if we want to return, then someone must bear the fruit of karma for me. Here, we can only wait for someone to break the boundary of the great Tao, then we can entrust the fruit of karma to that person, and then we can be free." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered slightly. If according to what Wei Ming said, then after the essence of creation was broken, the first person to reach the third realm would be the person who was used to bear the fruit of karma. According to this arrangement, if there were no accidents, then that person should be him. In this way, the action of the Supreme Being's thought transmission could also be explained. Its purpose was to guide the later spirit refinement cultivators to reach the third realm. If he really borrowed the treasure lotus of good fortune that the mighty figure revealed to him, he might not be able to use it as a guide in the end and would only be lost in the great Tao. After that, he would have no choice but to bear the karmic tribulation fruit of a certain great virtue and sink into it forever. And that great virtue, such as the one in front of him, would return in one piece without overturning everything. He thought in his heart, if it was really according to this inference, the reason why all the great virtues passed the essence of creation to the world after it was broken was not to leave behind some orthodoxy, but to guide someone who could bear the fruit of karma for them. But was the truth really like this? Chapter 2186. Wei Ming knew that Zhang Yan was different from them. He achieved it later and was the one who bore the tribulation fruit. However, he managed to avoid it for some reason. In order to prevent Zhang Yan from being displeased, he explained, "Fellow cultivator, please don't be displeased. I'm not targeting you, but the person who inherited the tribulation fruit. As long as the Tao inheritance doesn't die out, He can find someone else to replace him, and he will be able to escape. Zhang Yan chuckled. According to what he had said, this method was actually similar to passing a flower after a drum. The person who bore the tribulation fruit would wait for the next person to come, and when the tribulation fruit was entrusted to the next person, he would be free. He wouldn't be angry because of this. He didn't really fall into it. Moreover, it was doubtful if what he said was true. It was unlikely that there was only one method to escape the tribulation fruit. If it was him, he wouldn't walk to the end of the path if he was in this situation. It might not be the same for all the Vedanta. There was a simple and powerful piece of evidence here, and that was that Wei Ming was the only person who had entrusted his will into the void of silence. It was impossible to say that the other Vedanta couldn't do this. They just didn't do it. As for Yao Han, Ji Zhuang, and the others, since they were able to recover their powers without touching the fruit of tribulation, and even before their powers were fully recovered, it meant that the shattering of the essence of creation might not have had much to do with them. There was also the sword-bearing Taoist who was suspected to be the Shaoqing Grandmaster. Part of his Weili could survive in the void. However, with the Shaoqing Grandmaster's way of doing things, it was impossible for him to participate in this. Even if he was entangled by the tribulation fruit, he would probably choose to fight it alone and not choose a junior to replace him. Therefore, what Wei Ming said should be his own method of returning. At least, he didn't believe that everyone was prepared to do so. However, it could be seen that these Vedanta more or less had arrangements for their return. It was just that the method was different. He thought for a while and said, "Since you've returned, why did you come down?" Wei Ming said, "Naturally, we will first remove the Weili that was placed in the Pauline, in case there is another turbulence. As for what comes next, we will naturally observe the creation and comprehend the Tao." When he spoke up to here, he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. A long time ago, the essence of creation was originally perfect and flawless, and it was difficult to comprehend. So we utilized methods with the intention of finding the secrets of the upper realm from within it, yet we never expected that it would cause a calamity later on. But now that this essence of creation has been shattered, there's instead a trace of a chance to comprehend it. The changes in the workings of the heavens are really extremely unfathomable, and even people like us who've manifested our Tao are unable to predict it. Zhang Yan, since we're talking about this matter, I would like to ask another question. How many fellow Taoists have comprehended the essence of creation in the past? Why did it shatter later? Wei Ming shook his head and said, "Although I've returned, the shattering of the essence of creation has also caused me to lose a part of my Weili, and there's also a force of calamity blocking it, so I only remember this matter, but I can't explain the specific situation. Perhaps I'll only know when my cultivation returns." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He could feel that what Wei Ming said was not false. When he traveled in the Great Path Galaxy, he once tried to see the shattering of the essence of creation, but he was blocked by a force. This might be the force of calamity that Wei Ming spoke of. Originally, he wanted to ask if Wei Ming knew the background of the Taoist from before, but from the current situation, it seemed that Wei Ming had no way of knowing. So he bowed to Wei Ming and said, "Thank you for clearing up my doubts." Wei Ming also bowed to Wei Ming, then his figure faded and he had already disappeared. Zhang Yan looked into the depths of the void silence. He could feel that whether it was the wills of the Vedanta returning or the Weili causing trouble behind the scenes, they were all constantly seeping into the void silence. When these two forces combined, it would form a great pushing force. Perhaps it wouldn't be long before those Vedanta would return one by one. It was also for this reason that he just now released Wei Ming. Because even if he didn't do this, Wei Ming would return sooner or later, so it was better to solve this matter in advance. Otherwise, if two Vedanta returned at the same time, they might not be able to stop the immortals. Apart from this, he had another purpose. Behind the Taoist who thought that he was a Vedanta, there was a force pushing, and sooner or later, something would happen again. If there was only one Vedanta in the void silence, then he would definitely be the only one. Instead of that, it was better to release another person to share the pressure with him. At this moment, he turned his gaze and looked at the mirror lake. Since Yao Han and Ji Zhuang had obstructed his Tao path, then he had to repay them. However, he was not in a hurry to deal with them now, because he sensed that the two of them seemed to be involved with something else. He could wait until that thing appeared, then deal with it. With a thought, he instantly returned to Bu Su Tian. Shen Chang, Zhang Yuan, Qing Sheng, and the others saw him return and quickly came forward to greet him, saying, "Greetings, Taoist Shen Yuan." Zhang Yan nodded in return, saying, "This time, thanks to your help, we were able to protect Bu Su Tian." Taoist Shen Chang hurriedly said, "Taoist friend, you are too kind. We all know what we are capable of. Even without us, Bu Su Tian would not have been destroyed by external enemies." Zhang Yan said, "Now that I have reached the 3rd level, I have gained some insights. Later, I will discuss Tao with you all." When everyone heard this, they could not help but be overjoyed. Although Zhang Yan said it was a discussion, he was actually giving them pointers in disguise. They did not expect to achieve the same Vedanta as Zhang Yan, but if they could improve their cultivation, it would be good too. Now that the form of will had returned, there was obviously no need to cut off the Tao and suppress the achievements of many deity refinement cultivators. In fact, the power of Pauline that was suppressing the world and everyone had disappeared just now. It was obvious that Ji Zhuang saw that the situation was not right and quietly withdrew it. After a few more words with the crowd, Zhang Yan returned to Qinghuan Palace. He first calculated with his technique, then sat down. Achieving Vedanta was not the end of his Tao journey. Even though he understood the Tao of being and nothingness, he could not reach the source of the Tao galaxy. He believed that any Vedanta who opened the boundary of the Tao and returned to the Tao of being and nothingness would want to be free from the shackles of the Tao as soon as possible. It was no wonder that those Vedanta did not hesitate to create the essence of creation in order to find a way to improve. Just now, when Wei Ming talked to him, she thought that this thing was broken, but it was more beneficial for him to understand the upper realm. He agreed with this point. He once imagined that if he looked at all the places of creation and the fragments of creation, would he be able to solve the mystery of the Tao? This might not be the right solution, but it was worth a try. It was just that the broken essence of creation was spread all over the void and attached to many of the real worlds. The two were mixed together and it was not easy to find them. Moreover, some of the real worlds had been overturned and swallowed, so it was hard to say if some of the land of creation and fragments had disappeared along with the real worlds. To find them, the only way to find them was to recreate everything. He calculated in his heart that to do this, he had to gather all the places of creation of Pauline, so there was no need to think about it now. There was one thing that was worth paying attention to now. In fact, when the essence of creation shattered, not only did it transform into the places of creation and the fragments of creation, but all the living beings that were born in these things were actually born from the essence of creation. It could be said that their spirits were a part of the essence of creation. Moreover, these living beings did not only fall into the worlds that contained the essence of creation, but there were also many scattered in the worlds that appeared and disappeared. When Qinshi passed down the Tao analysis technique earlier, Gao Qingtu had once wondered exactly where his strength came from, and he'd searched for the Tao for a few hundreds of years. Actually, these living beings were formed from the qi of creation, and their strength was hidden within themselves, so they only had to slowly dig it out. After he saw this, he understood that if he wanted to see the original essence of creation completely, then these living beings that were formed from the qi of creation couldn't be ignored. And if they could sincerely worship the Tao technique that he created, then he might be able to make up for this missing part. On the other side, Yao Han and Ji Zhuang were hiding in the depths of the mirror lake. After the two returned, they sat across from each other on the altar and did not speak for a long time. Ji Zhuang Daoren broke the silence and said in a deep voice, "Taoist Xinyuan achieved Bhadra, and we failed to obstruct his path. He definitely won't let us go, so what should we do?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "There is no other way but to protect the mirror lake." Ji Zhuang Daoren shook his head. "I'm afraid it will be difficult to protect the mirror lake." But he himself was a part of the Bhadra's power, so he naturally knew about the Bhadra Wali. Not to mention the mirror lake, even existences like Bu Su Tian might not be able to stop it. Ancestor Yao Han said, "Since he has returned, why don't we go and meet him?" Ji Zhuang said, "Our original bodies don't have any relationship with him, and this will offend Taoist Xinyuan." He may not come to help us. Ancestor Yao Han said, since there is no other way, it's worth a try. Zhizhuang Daoren was not optimistic about this and sighed, let's give it a try. Ancestor Yao Han said, but there is a problem. If Taoist Xianyuan uses his Weili to obstruct us, we Weili won't be able to find him. Taoist Zhizhuang thought about it and said, it's fine. That existence still has a clone suppressing this place. That person should be formed by that fellow Taoist's mighty power. If I talk to him about this, that fellow Taoist will definitely know. He waved the lotus in his hand and the avatar was pulled out. The avatar's body also became solid. He was a little surprised and sneered, why? Are the two of you looking for me again? Ancestor Yao Han said, we want to speak to the fellow Taoist behind you. Behind me, the avatar was startled, but its body rippled and turned into another Taoist in the blink of an eye. He smiled and said, what business do you two have with me? Somewhere in the void, Taoist Wei Ming suddenly frowned, realizing that he had overlooked something. But after some calculations, he couldn't find anything, so he gave up. Chapter 2187. Both Yao Han and Zhizhuang were shocked. They didn't expect to see this Taoist here. But wasn't this wisp Weili supposed to be here? How did it become this Taoist? However, they still thought that this Taoist was a great virtue, so it wasn't strange for him to have such abilities. Moreover, this Taoist had dealt with them before, so it was easier for them to talk to him. Zhizhuang said, we were trying to stop Taoist Xianyuan from returning, but we failed on the verge of success. If he comes to deal with us, I'm afraid we won't be able to stop him. So, I would like to ask for your guidance. The Taoist said, that Taoist's magic power is profound, and I'm no match for him. Right now, I'm just borrowing the power of this wisp to return. I can barely protect myself, but I can't protect you. Ancestor Yao Han chuckled. If it was truly impossible, fellow Taoist wouldn't be here. If you have any plans, just tell me. Zhizhuang Daoren didn't say anything. He could tell that this Taoist was here with a purpose. The Taoist smiled. If Taoist Xianyuan wants to, you too won't be able to protect yourselves and the lake. If you want to escape, how about this? Each of you give me a strand of your qi, and I'll try to protect your foundations. Even if you're in danger, you'll still have a chance to come back. Yao Han and Zhizhuang thought about it. This method was to leave behind a small portion of their Weili and entrust it to the Taoist. This way, even if they were killed by Zhang Yan, they still had a chance to come back. This was not what they wanted, but it was undoubtedly their only choice. If they were destroyed by Zhang Yan, there wouldn't be any qi left, and they might not be able to come back. Zhizhuang Daoren didn't hesitate. With a thought, he left a strand of qi and bowed. Then I'll leave it to you, Taoist. If Zhang Yan didn't come and let this matter pass, then he wouldn't lose anything. If he really came knocking, then he could guarantee that he would still have a chance of surviving as a Weili. The Taoist retracted Zhizhuang Daoren's aura, then looked at Patriarch Yao Han and waited for him to make a decision. Forefather Yao Han chuckled, fine, I won't do that. I believe fellow Taoist has no objections? The Taoist was a little surprised at first, but he quickly smiled. Of course I won't do that. This is your choice, why should I force you? He looked at the two of them again. If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave. Zhizhuang Daoren said, fellow Taoist, please wait a moment. If we want to find you, what should we do? The Taoist shook his head and said with a smile, it's better if we don't talk to each other anymore. The more we interact, the more Taoist Xianyuan will find out. With that, he turned around and used some unknown method to escape from Pauline's suppression. Seeing him leave, Zhizhuang Daoren asked Forefather Yao Han, fellow Taoist, if you don't leave your aura behind, aren't you afraid that you won't be able to return? Forefather Yao Han said, compared to that, I'm more worried that I'll be used by him and lose my freedom. Zhizhuang Daoren was silent for a while, then said, so what if I lose my freedom? There's always a chance that I'll return. Forefather Yao Han smiled. I'm different from you, fellow Taoist. I think it's better to make my own decisions. Although Zhang Yan was sitting in the sky, he had sensed something before and deduced that Yao Han and Zhizhuang would come into contact with something. Thus, he had been paying attention to the movements at the mirror lake. Even if the two sealed the lake, it wouldn't be of much use to a virtuous benevolence like him. The Taoist's appearance and disappearance didn't escape his eyes. He was sure that the Taoist was already dead and no longer existed. Therefore, the one that appeared now had nothing to do with the one before. The two looked the same and had the same consciousness because the Whaley behind them came from the same source. He thought about it. It was easy to kill this person now, but as long as the Whaley behind them didn't disappear, they would still fall into the modern realm. Since that was the case, it was better to keep them alive for now. That way, he would be able to see their every move. But since this person had appeared, the matter of the lake should come to an end. With a thought, one of his avatars flew out of Bushutian and appeared in front of the mirror lake. With just one step, the surface of the lake rippled like water, and he had already stepped into the land of fortune. All of the restrictions inside seemed to be non-existent, and there was no reaction. Song Xiao, Xian Che, Rindu, Yu Qiu, and Yu Lu all felt something was wrong and rushed out of the station. Zhang Yan merely glanced indifferently at them. Under this gaze, the figures of the five of them couldn't help but stop, and their vital energy plummeted from high above. At the same time, their bodies transformed from material to ethereal, and they vanished in an instant. They didn't exist in the world any longer. After he opened the boundary of the Grand Tao and grasped the path of being and nothingness, as long as he didn't think someone or something existed, then the Grand Tao would also think the same. Therefore, he only needed a thought to turn these people into nothingness and send them into eternal silence. After dealing with these five, he didn't stop and went straight into the depths of the lake. Soon, he arrived before a spell platform. Ji Zhuang and Yao Han also saw the scene outside and knew that they had no chance against a virtuous benevolence. Ancestor Yao Han cupped his hands towards Ji Zhuang and said, "Since the lake can't stop this person, I'll take my leave first." Ji Zhuang Daoren had already sensed his goal and nodded, "Fellow Taoist, please go." Patriarch Yao Han sat down cross-legged, and it didn't take long for his body to dissipate. He had acted on his own, dispersing his own power. This method also didn't exist in the world, but at least he wouldn't be suppressed by a virtuous benevolence like Zhang Yan. This meant that the original Whaley had a chance to return. Zhang Yan had already arrived at the altar. Patriarch Yao Han had destroyed himself, and Zhang Yan could see that there was not a shred of his mighty power left in the world. This meant that the consciousness of this incarnation had dissipated. Even if it returned, it would not be the same person as before. In that case, there was no need to pursue this matter. Jizhuang Daoren stood up and cupped his hands. "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan looked at him and said, "I have a question. Did you comprehend the essence of creation with me?" Jizhuang Daoren shook his head. "I didn't do such a thing. It's just that the essence of creation was destroyed, so I couldn't avoid being dragged into it. If fellow Taoist wants to know the details, I won't be able to answer unless I'm fully recovered." Zhang Yan nodded and waved his sleeves. Jizhuang Daoren dissipated like smoke. He had a thought. Whether it was Ji Zhuang or Yao Han, they did not have any robbery power entangling them. Perhaps that was the reason that the Taoist had targeted them. But even though the Taoist escaped, he was still under his surveillance. No matter what he wanted to do, he would know. At this moment, he raised his head. With a thought, the entire mirror lake was under his Whaley. Taoist Wei Ming searched repeatedly in the void. Relying on the great virtue Whaley, he soon found a place of creation. Although it was small, it was enough for him to stay. Originally, regardless of whether it was the mirror lake or the blessed land left behind by Yuan Mo, they could be considered excellent places to stay. However, he could also sense that Zhang Yan seemed to have some connection with these two places, so he simply gave up on them. In fact, to him, other than places like Bu Su Tian, where the essence of creation was condensed, any other place of creation was the same. After he sat down, he began to calculate the path to the upper realm in an attempt to break free from the shackles of the Great Tao. When the essence of creation collapsed, he did gain something. He saw many things that were extremely useful for climbing to the upper realm. Unfortunately, these were all blocked by the tribulation power. If he wanted to recover the lost part of power, he would have to eliminate this tribulation power. But the tribulation power did not come from him alone. It also existed in the other great virtues. So if these great virtues returned, they might be able to dissolve the tribulation power together. But before that, because he returned one step earlier, he could seize the initiative. He did the same thing as Zhang Yan. He wanted to observe the place of creation essence and use it to find the way to the upper realm. But at this moment he found a problem and could not help but frown. Is that so? At this moment, in the myriad heavens and realms of Bu Su Tian, the cultivators who invaded the Mirror Lake were gradually wiped out by Dan Yi and the others. In addition, the broken passage in Bu Su Tian was closed. Everyone realized that the situation was over. Except for a small number of cultivators who fell outside the 4 major tribes, the rest either surrendered or were killed by the cultivators of the various sections. Originally, the major sects were ready to wipe out these scattered cultivators in one go to avoid future troubles. But at this time, they suddenly found that the Tao that had been cut off had returned. The cultivators who practiced the old techniques were all happy. This meant that even if they could not cultivate in this life, they could still find the way to immortality after reincarnation. So they temporarily stopped, reopened the mountain gate, and sorted out the interior. When Dan Yi and the others saw this, they withdrew their inner worlds as well. Originally, they were only doing this for the sake of preserving the old Tao arts so that they didn't have to worry about being cut off. Now that there was no need to use it, there was naturally no need to continue maintaining it. However, the Tao techniques that were established after the Tao techniques were severed weren't abandoned because of this. After all, after over 1,000 years, there had truly been many sects that purely worshipped new techniques, and their inheritances relied on this. It was impossible for them to change in a short period of time. It was just that because the creation Pauline no longer produced spiritual vigor, the prosperity of the various realms was interrupted. Moreover, because the spiritual vigor was previously shaped by Pauline Whaley, each realm itself did not change much. Therefore, the spiritual vigor of many realms began to decline rapidly, and many sects that took advantage of the situation declined as a result. But all of this had nothing to do with the Yen sect because the disciples of the Yen sect didn't need spiritual qi to cultivate, and they only needed to unearth themselves. After the great enemies retreated and they got through the difficulties, many disciples of the Yen sect that came from different worlds were prepared to return to their original worlds. At this moment, there was movement on the Tao inheritance tablet that supported the heavens and the earth. Chapter 2188. The movement of the technique inheritance stone tablet was Zhang Yan's attempt to improve the Tao technique once again, making up for the last loophole that he knew in the Tao technique of Yen teaching. The Tao technique of Yen teaching was different from the old technique. It focused on digging one's own body. If the path of Tao was smooth and the Tao heart was firm, one could cultivate to the level of mortal transformation without relying on external objects. However, there was one point here. Without Zhou Huanyuan Jade, one still couldn't enter the true Yang realm. Although the Vedanta broke through the boundaries of the great Tao, they couldn't create the essence of creation out of thin air. They even needed to borrow this item to observe the great Tao. But the essence of the mysterious stone was the accumulation of the essence of creation, so they could only wait for it to be born on its own and couldn't interfere. Although spirit refinement cultivators could raise people to the true Yang realm, just like what Yao Han, Ji Zhuang, and the others did before, it was impossible for such cultivators to cultivate further. Instead, it would affect the living beings in the world. Under normal circumstances, it was useless to spirit refinement cultivators, so there was no need to do so. However, he also discovered that all living beings in the 9 continents weren't born from the qi of creation. Logically speaking, when the essence of creation shattered, even the almighty spirit refinement cultivators were involved, so the living beings in the world of mortals couldn't avoid it either. But the 9 continents were an exception. It seemed that the shattering of the essence of creation didn't affect them at all. It wasn't difficult for him to sense that the 9 continents were a unique existence in the world. If he wanted to see its true secrets, he had to go there himself. However, he also felt that it was best not to return now. Based on his premonition, he felt that he might be of use in this place after coming down. At that time, he would be able to solve his doubts, but if he returned now, he would miss something. After finishing off Ji Zhuang, Yao Han, and the people behind them, not only did he take over the Mirror Lake, but he also took over the land of creation that Yuan Mei had stayed in. The land of creation that was half ruled by Ji Zhuang was naturally completely occupied by him. In these places of creation, he had also passed down the Dao technique of the Yen sect. It was slightly different from what Bu Su Tian and the other sects had passed down. These places were completely dominated by the Yen sect. However, he could also predict that when the other Vedanta returned in succession, they would definitely realize this. Perhaps they would create their own Dao techniques and compete with him. On the surface, the battle for the Dao legacy seemed to be completely dependent on the number of lands of creation. However, in reality, it was still dependent on whose human Dao was more profound. Otherwise, they would not be able to defend these places. He didn't think that those great virtues that hadn't returned were only as strong as Wei Ming. Just take Wei Ming, for example. A portion of her power was trapped by the tribulation power. Perhaps it could be understood that the earlier one returned to being, the more power one would lose. But on the other hand, the later the Vedanta returned, the stronger they were. Regardless of what this person's attitude was after returning to the gods, he needed to be prepared for conflict. He had a creation Pauline that had previously borne the tribulation power by his hand. Once the tribulation power dissipated, he could use it for himself. However, this was still not enough. Thus, he raised his hand and took out the Tai golden pearl. He could feel that before the essence of creation shattered, the great virtue didn't need anything other than the creation Pauline. However, after the essence of creation shattered, if the treasure that was nurtured in such a place of creation was properly refined, it would be of great use in battles with peers. In the past, he refined it merely to make it better for him to use it, or to make it compatible with his qi. At the end of the day, it was to be able to bear his own Weili while exerting the full power of the Golden Pearl's Weili. However, its true power might be able to pose a slight threat to deity refinement cultivators in the first and second stages, but when it came to the level of the great virtue, it was somewhat insufficient. And now, if he wanted to improve the treasure's power, he could only use the creation essence of the same origin to refine it. In fact, this thing was flawless the moment it was born. It was very difficult to push its power to the next level, because being flawless meant that it would never change. It was eternal and it would never spoil. But there was no real thing in the world that was flawless. Even deity refinement cultivators would be driven into eternal silence. No matter how perfect the Tai Golden Pearl was, it was still under the Great Tao. And the great virtue was precisely a part of the Great Tao. It was the reflection of the Great Tao that entered the world. Divine light gathered in his eyes. He looked over, and the boundary of the Great Tao attached to the Tai Golden Pearl was immediately reflected. If he completely opened the boundary of the Great Tao, he could certainly complete this item. However, because the consciousness of the Tai Golden Pearl had been obliterated, it would only disappear from the world and could not return. Therefore, what he needed to do was to slightly break through the boundary. This would cause a certain amount of damage to the Golden Pearl, but as the saying goes, without destruction, there can be no construction. This was the only way he could use the essence of creation to refine it. Thinking of this, he lifted his sleeve and lightly brushed the surface of the Golden Pearl. In the main hall of the Yen sect's headquarters, Gao Qingtu summoned all the protectors of the sect to discuss what to do from now on. After all the internal matters were settled, a protector came out and said, "Although our Yen sect is spread all over the world, we have never been to the Kuan-Shi continent. That place is the place where the spiritual opportunity of the myriad worlds flourishes the most. If the new and old sects are powerful, they will set up a branch there. Our Yen sect should also set up a branch there." Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice, "I have also thought about Protector Yu's words before. However, the spiritual opportunity of the Kuan-Shi continent is extremely abundant. Ferocious monsters and great demons can be found everywhere. Our Yen sect does not have enough manpower to guard it. Instead, we have to divide our strength. Moreover, our Yen sect does not have an advantage in the place where spiritual opportunity flourishes. We can discuss this again in the future. The protector surnamed you was a little disappointed, but since Gao Chengtu did not agree, he could only obey. He cupped his hands and left. At this moment, another protector stood out and said in a loud voice, "Sect Master, the last time the cultivators from beyond the heavens invaded our Bu Su heaven, I discovered that there were many people from the Luo sect and the Virtue sect mixed among them. Later on, the gate of heaven closed, and they are suspected to be hiding in the desolate world. This generation is our great enemy. We cannot give them the chance to grow stronger. We should find them earlier and kill them." The protectors under him all agreed with him. During the invasion of the Mirror Lake, the Luo sect and the Virtue sect also invaded together. However, because the strength of these two sects was not high, they were not the main force. Later on, most of the cultivators of Bu Su heaven retreated to the four major tribes. Without the help of the almighty cultivators, they also did not have the ability to cross the world. Therefore, this generation was able to survive after the end of the war between the two worlds. Although the bodies of Yao Han and Ji Zhuang that had entered the world no longer existed, the Taoist techniques passed down by the two could still lead to the Great Tao. It could be said that they were not inferior to the Tao teachings of the Yen sect. If they were given enough time, they would definitely rise again. Because of the previous battles, the protectors of the Yen sect knew that only these two sects were their true enemies in the future. They must find a way to eliminate them. Gao Chengtu pondered for a moment and said, "Even if the Yen sect can travel between the realms, there is still no almighty cultivator in our sect who can open a realm pass. We can't go to the place where this generation is hiding. How about this? I will go to the mountain and sea realm to pay a visit to the sun and moon monarchs and see if I can ask them to help. If not, I will find a way to borrow the name of the sect master to pay a visit to the four great Yuanzun." While they were talking, a disciple came up to the hall and said, reporting to the sect master, "A Taoist from the outer realm has come. He said that the Yen sect has a problem, so he came to help me solve it." Gao Chengtu's heart stirred. He stood up from his seat and said, "Quickly invite him in." Under normal circumstances, only disciples who cultivated the Tao teachings of the Yen sect could stay at the main altar. However, if he, the sect master, allowed it, he could also invite outsiders in. After a moment, a Taoist with a sword on his back walked in and said, "I Dongguang greet sect master Gao." Gao Chengtu returned the greeting and said, "May I know where you are from, sect master Gao?" Dongguang said, "I have a relationship with the Yen sect. While I was watching, I calculated that you were in trouble, so I came here to help. It's not that I don't want to repay you. What does sect master Gao think?" Gao Chengtu knew that this person might be related to the sect master, so he nodded without much hesitation and said, "My Yen sect owes Taoist a favor." Dongguang said, "If that's the case, sect master Gao, please set up the altar. I will cast a spell on it and open the realm gate for your sect." In a certain land of creation, Wei Ming frowned. He saw from his deduction that the essence of creation was extremely broken. Other than the land of creation, a part of the living beings formed by the chi of creation was also separated from it. In this way, even if he looked through all the land of creation and its fragments, there would still be some gaps. Only by filling up this part could it be completed just now. As long as the spirit of creation acknowledged the Tao created by a certain virtue, then this part of the spirit of creation would naturally be filled up. However, the spirit of creation was not an inanimate object after all. Its thoughts were fickle. If it changed to worship the Tao or worshipped another great virtue, then it would no longer belong to his side. It was useless to force it here because if he applied it waily, it would be going against it and it would no longer belong to his Tao. On the other hand, the Tao teachings could kill each other and destroy the Tao teachings of the other's spirit. However, he couldn't use it now. He could feel that it was much easier to comprehend the Tao teachings than before. However, with the addition of the spirit of creation, the great virtues could no longer make decisions based on their own will. Instead, they were restrained to a certain extent. Of course, if the great virtues didn't want to climb higher, then these spirits of creation would no longer be important to them. If they still wanted to pursue the Tao, then they must be gathered. He couldn't help but ponder. If he wanted to bring these spirits of creation to his side, then the best way was to pass down his Tao teachings to them. It seemed that the land of creation wasn't as insignificant as he thought before. If he could occupy one, then as long as no one fought for it, he could ensure that the living beings inside believed in his Tao teachings. Thinking about this, he couldn't help but sigh and say, I miscalculated. He thought about how Zhang Yan occupied Busu Tian. Other than that, there were at least 2 more land of creation in his hands, which was already far ahead of him. What was more troublesome was that it wasn't difficult for him to imagine that when his fellow Taoists returned one by one, they would quickly discover this matter. If this generation still wanted to pursue the Tao, then they would definitely fight with him for the ownership of the spirits of creation. In the end, fighting between them was inevitable. Chapter 2189. Ever since Zhang Yan had started to refine the Taiyi Golden Pearl, Bushu Tian's Weili spiritual essence had been channeled by him and gathered in the Qinghuan Palace. Such a supreme treasure was originally the result of nature, and it was a complete ball. However, at this moment, what appeared before him was a puddle of soft golden liquid that floated in midair and was ceaselessly dispersing. However, as the creation essence qi was channeled into the golden liquid through a certain method, the golden liquid was like a bowl, gradually filling up. It then tried to congregate and close the golden liquid several times. Finally, with a buzzing sound, it condensed into a golden pearl. Zhang Yan raised his hand and held it in the palm of his hand. The golden luster on the surface of this treasure had completely faded away. Instead, it was translucent like colored glaze. There were 9 tiny holes in the middle that were interconnected with each other. A dense white mist floated out from the holes. It looked ethereal and otherworldly, full of celestial charm. He thought about it carefully. It turned out that the gold of the golden pearl was indestructible and perfect. Now that this treasure had been refined and changed its appearance, it was no longer suitable to be called this. Instead, it should be called God. Therefore, from now on, this object would be called the Supreme Divine Pearl. After being tempered by him, the power of the treasure did not immediately increase by much. However, it could be continuously nourished using the creation essence qi. In other words, this treasure had a large upper limit of improvement in the future. However, this was only secondary. The key was that this object had once broken the limit of the great Tao. When he fought with Vedanta, it would no longer be affected by the change of existence. Without his permission, it would be impossible for outsiders to easily remove the Weili with this method. With this item, he would be able to prepare an offensive weapon and rely on Bushu Tian for defense. In that case, if he were to fight against the returning Vedanta, it would be easy to advance or retreat. With a flick of his sleeve, he put it away. The creation Weili that had gathered also calmed down. Then he sank into his divine decree. With a single thought, the Taoist divine decree that transmitted the upper state's divine decree to him appeared again. But at this moment in his eyes, this person was damaged and incomplete. The reason for this was because this person's entire appearance was damaged to begin with. If it was said that this great virtue was obstructed by the power of tribulation, which was why it resulted in such a result after being transmitted into the world, he could understand. However, he did not sense any power of tribulation from the Taoist's will. He looked like a dull and rigid figure, and there was nothing worth investigating. He originally thought that this person was very likely to cooperate with Wei Ming to guide the lower realm cultivator to the 3rd stage so that he could bear the consequences of the tribulation. But now it seemed that there shouldn't be any connection between him and Wei Ming. It should be purely out of his own will. He thought about it carefully. There had to be something that he had yet to see through, and he had a feeling that the other party had yet to pass on something to him. At this moment, he seemed to have thought of something. He flipped his hand and took out the creation Pauline. Then, he plucked a lotus petal from the Pauline and sent it to the Taoist's figure with a flick of his finger. In the blink of an eye, the damaged parts were slightly mended. A light flashed in his eyes. It seemed that his idea was correct. Perhaps it was to hide from something, or perhaps it was because it had no other choice. There was something buried in the Pauline, and he needed to send it to the Taoist side to see the truth. It was just that there was still tribulation power in the Pauline. Before resolving it, it couldn't be completely handed over. Luckily, he knew where the direction was, so it would be much easier. In the future, he only needed to find a way to resolve the tribulation power and he would know the answer. While he was refining treasures and looking for clues, he didn't stop looking for the place of creation. The more such realms there were, the more creation essence he could take in, and the more creation spirits he could gather. After the great virtue returned, if he wanted to go up, he would definitely compete with him. At that time, it would be even more difficult to find it, so he could only seize this opportunity. However, at this moment, his mana fluctuated and he sensed Wei Ming's appearance outside of Bu Su Tian. He guessed that something was up, so he created a clone and went to the front of him. He said, "Taoist friend, why are you looking for me?" Wei Ming bowed and said, "I won't hide it from Taoist friend. When I returned, I indeed saw traces of the path of Tao, but this tribulation fell on the land of creation. The more such places are found, the more likely it is to see the truth. I think Taoist friend is doing the same thing now. Although we are looking for the same thing, we don't have to fight. I have a suggestion. If we find another land of creation, how about I exchange it with Taoist friend for observation?" His suggestion was just a test. If Zhang Yan agreed, it would be the best. He could seize an opportunity before the other great virtue arrived. He believed that this was also beneficial to Zhang Yan. After all, they couldn't fight now. It was important to know that the creation Pauline in each other's hands was now dependent on each other. This way, they couldn't resolve the overflowing Weili during the battle. If the two sides collided, it could lead to the collapse of everything. At least for now, compromise and cooperation was better than fighting. Zhang Yan thought about it. Other than Bu Su Tian, it was fine for Wei Ming to observe the other places as long as the other party could take out a land of creation of equal value. Moreover, with such an exchange, as long as he firmly held onto Bu Su Tian, he would definitely be ahead of the other party. So he nodded and said, "This method is feasible." Wei Ming bowed and said, "Then it's settled with Taoist friend." He didn't ask for it to be done immediately. He only had one land of creation in his hands, and there was no need to be so anxious before the other great virtue returned. He could wait until he gathered a few more places, then he would look for Zhang Yan. Among everyone, only he and Zhang Yan had the highest cultivation, so there was no conflict for the time being. There was still enough room for maneuver between the two. But if there were one or two more people of the same generation, the situation would be different. He wanted to take advantage of the current situation as much as possible and gain a certain advantage before the next great virtue returned. Inside the meeting hall of Bu Su Tian, Zhang Yan had left a doppelganger here since his return. Every day he would preach the Tao. Every time the spirit refinement cultivators in Bu Su Tian listened, they felt that they had gained a lot. One day, after listening to the preaching, Taoist Zhanyun called out to Taoist Shunchang and said, "We have been cultivating here for a long time. Taoist friend, do you have any intention of leaving this place?" Taoist Shunchang asked curiously, "Why do you ask?" Taoist Zhanyun said, "When I was discussing the Tao with Taoist friend Qing Sheng, he seemed to have the intention of leaving." Shunchang nodded and said, "I see." It was not strange that Zhan Yuan and Qing Sheng were discussing the Tao. After all, only the three of them were seeking their own Tao. Even if they had some disputes in the past, they would not reject each other if it was beneficial for them to seek the Tao. However, it was not surprising that Qing Sheng had such thoughts. If he had a choice, he would not be willing to live under someone else's roof. But he did not agree with this approach. He shook his head and said, "Since we are seeking our own Tao, why should we care about where we are going? Don't think that without Ji Zhuang, Yao Han, and the others, the emptiness would be peaceful." From what fellow Taoist Shen Yuan had said, perhaps in the future, the Vedanta would return. If there was a conflict between the Vedanta, how could the power that would be stirred up be comparable to that existence? If he wants to leave, let him go. We don't have to worry about it. Now that the threat of that existence was gone, it seemed that they could leave Busushan and find a place to settle down. But he was not sure what would happen next. The two great virtues, Zhang Yan and Wei Ming, did not seem to have any conflicts at the moment, but it would not be surprising if they fought each other. The conflict between the two was not a joke, and it was not as safe as hiding in Busushan. Taoist Zhangyan thought for a while and said, Taoist friend's words are reasonable. It seems to be peaceful, but it is just that a big fight has not started. Taoist Shunchang said, so we don't have to worry about anything. We just need to cultivate our own Tao. Coincidentally, Luan Fang and Bing Kong were also discussing this matter when they returned to the place where they had settled down. Luan Fang said, we have been listening to Taoist friend Xuanyuan's Tao preaching for the past few days. Although it has benefited us a lot, we have to seek external Tao. We need to find fragments of good fortune or understand the land of good fortune in order to complete ourselves. No matter how profound our Tao cultivation is, we can't do anything without external objects. But now, Bing Kong raised his head and said, since we can't seek, then we won't seek. Luan Fang was startled and said, don't seek? Then he seemed to realize something and murmured, don't seek. Bing Kong said, if we seek now, we will be fighting against the great virtues. Can we fight against them? How can we not see the end of their Tao? It is better to protect ourselves first. We don't have to think about the rest for now. When Luan Fang thought of Yao Han and the other two, he sighed and said, that's fine as well. Back then, we took a step back, and we were able to survive until now. Now that heaven's will is unpredictable, we might as well take another step back. In the depths of the void, the Taoist had been hiding after leaving the Mirror Lake. Later, when he saw that Zhang Yan did not search for him, he guessed that he had not exposed himself. After carefully probing it a few more times, he finally relaxed. With a slight thought, the broken petals of the lotus floated over and reformed into a lotus. However, this was only a part of the lotus, it wasn't the entirety of the lotus. Holding the Pauline, he shook it slightly and more power was guided over. This caused the Pauline to become brighter and smaller lotus petals to emerge from it. He raised his hand and took out a part of the qi dynamic that Ji Zhuang had given him and threw it into the lotus. He then lifted it up and shook it gently. It was as if there was an unfathomable power that connected with him. A mysterious smile appeared on his face. One of Zhang Yan's avatars was standing in Bushutian and he saw the person's every move. He could see that the person was trying to summon a great virtues. From the looks of it, it might be Ji Zhuang. He did not interfere because there seemed to be an opening. As long as the power seeped in, there would be no way to stop it. Moreover, even if Ji Zhuang came back, he could kill him at any time. He would not be a threat to him. However, he did not understand why the person was doing this. If the Taoist was formed from the Weili of great virtues, then it was understandable. However, the Taoist was not a great virtue. He came from another power. There was no connection between the two. Though he had some guesses about the source of this power, he had no way to prove it. He could only wait for the person to expose himself. After all, the more he did, the more clues he could see. Chapter 2190. Zhang Yan made a slight calculation. Judging from the movements of the two forces, even without the Taoist spell, the second Vedanta would soon return to being. Therefore, the Taoist's action was only a slight push. The only difference was that this Taoist might not be seeking the return of a single virtuous virtue, but for every virtuous virtue to return to all. If not for the fact that this Taoist had nothing to do with the virtuous virtue Weili and was instead an extension of another power, he would have thought that this Taoist was the true convergence of the wills of all the virtuous virtues. He pondered for a moment and made another deduction. This time, he made an unexpected discovery. In fact, the virtuous virtue Weili summoned by this Taoist was not certain. He borrowed Ji Zhuang's qi activity to communicate with the virtuous virtue, but he did not care who he was communicating with. He had sensed in the great Tao of stars that all the powers were entangled together. With this Taoist's current ability, it would not be easy to find a single virtuous virtue. Thinking of this, his heart stirred. If that was the case, why couldn't he control the power and summon the one he wanted to see? Just because the Taoist could not do it did not mean that he could not. The one who would soon return to all was unknown whether he was a friend or a foe, and he did not know if he had any relationship with Wei Ming. If the two of them combined were stronger than him, there was a possibility that they could threaten him. It had to be said that he was in control of many places of creation and the place where the essence of creation gathered the most. If the other virtuous virtues had enough power, it would not be strange for them to join forces to snatch it. Now that he had a choice, which one was suitable? Great Underworld Patriarch was the patriarch of Qinsong School, so perhaps he could try to guide him. However, he was not sure of Great Underworld Patriarch's cultivation, and he had no way to specifically sense the Patriarch Weili. The Patriarch might have passed down his orthodoxy in the 9 continents with the intention of nurturing the younger generation, but it was not necessarily for the younger generation to find him. The key was that his calculations were chaotic. There were either more mysteries involved here, or the time was not right. Thus, he gave up on the idea of guiding the Patriarch Weili. In the past, the 4 patriarchs left their orthodoxy in the 9 continents, and all of them had qi activity. Great Underworld Patriarch aside, there were 3 others. It could be said that Patriarch Yao Han's arrangements had been destroyed by him, so there was no need to mention it. Ancestral Master Ling Yu was mysterious and unfathomable, and he did not have any friendly relations with him. Instead, Ancestral Master Shaoqing was the most suitable. If he could summon this person's power back, they could form an alliance. However, he might not succeed. It wasn't that he wasn't capable enough, but that the other party might not accept his help. Fortunately, this incarnation of power was still in the infinite worlds, so there was no harm in asking him. He split out an incarnation and stepped out of Bu Su Tian. He silently circulated his mana and stirred up the sword qi. A moment later, the sword-wielding Taoist appeared in front of him. This time, the sword-wielding Taoist no longer had his back to him. Instead, the sword-wielding Taoist bowed and said, "It is a great virtue to see you again, fellow Taoist. I wish you success in your cultivation." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and said, "I invited fellow Taoist here today because I wanted to ask if I could help fellow Taoist return Weili. Would fellow Taoist be willing?" The sword-wielding Taoist waved his hand and said, "If I return, I will use the sword in my hand to cut through the obstacles, not the help of others." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He had also guessed that this would be the result. Since the sword-wielding Taoist was unwilling, he would not force it. After the two exchanged a few words, the sword-wielding Taoist disappeared without a trace as he came. Zhang Yan's thoughts returned to Bu Su Tian. Even if this person was unwilling to return, he actually had another target to choose from. As he was thinking, he suddenly sensed something in his heart. He looked at a certain place in Bu Su Tian, where a creation spirit that was about to be born was particularly bright. It was the first time he saw a living being with such dense creation qi. It could be said that it was very rare. If he could pull it into the Taoist missionary sect, it would be more useful than joining the tens of thousands of people. However, this spirit was so abnormal. It could be imagined that its will was very firm and would not necessarily be manipulated by others. But it did not matter even if it did not succeed. Even if this spirit could resist tens of thousands of people, compared to the countless living beings, it was still insignificant. Therefore, he only sent a thought to the lower realm and did not care about it anymore. Outside the 4 major tribes, in a certain world, the land was shaped like the mountain sea continent. The sky was like a canopy, and the ground was like a chessboard. More than 100 cultivators from the Virtue sect were trekking with difficulty in the desert. The wind and sand here were very strong, and the sand and stones were hard. When they came through the air, they had the power to destroy mountains. In the beginning, there were still people wandering in the sky, but they were turned into sieves by a gust of wind and sand. After that, no one dared to fly into the sky. Everyone was tired of the almost unchanging scenery around them. They had been walking here for dozens of days, but there were still no signs of walking out of this wasteland. At this moment, there was a strange movement under their feet. Then, a mound arched up. Suddenly, a strange beast that was covered in scales and looked like a snake came out. It swallowed a disciple of the Virtue sect in one gulp. The people at the side looked on indifferently and did not do anything. The person walking in front only looked back and continued to walk forward as if nothing had happened. After a few breaths, the snake python beast suddenly stiffened, its body swayed, and its abdomen suddenly exploded, shredded flesh and internal organs splattering out. Immediately after, a brilliant light flashed, and the person who had been swallowed escaped from inside, but after swaying a few times, he fell to the ground. Someone at the side went forward to check and found that the internal organs and flesh had been melted. He said to the people around him, "It's okay." After a while, the flesh and blood of the person who fell to the ground grew again. He crawled up and scolded, "What kind of world is this? The spiritual vigor is obviously weak, but the poisonous insects and strange beasts are so difficult to deal with." After he said that, everyone started to mutter. An old man in a Taoist robe who was not stained by a speck of dust said, "The transportation force of heaven and earth here is much stronger than other places. The living creatures that can survive here are naturally strong. I have already calculated that we are close to the edge of this wasteland. Everyone, please speed up. We will be able to leave this place in a few days." He was obviously the most prestigious person here. After he spoke, no one complained anymore. Soon, the day ended. As the sun set and the heat receded, there was a strong chill. However, the Luo denomination people were all cultivators. They did not feel anything strange. They did not have the intention to stop and rest. They continued on their way. At this moment, more than 10 starlights suddenly fell from the sky. It was unusually conspicuous in the empty night sky. After the old man saw it, he showed a serious expression. A middle-aged cultivator walked to the front and said, "Elder E, this light does not look like a meteor. It looks like a cultivator's escape light that breaks through the atmosphere." The old man grunted and said, "Be careful. It might be someone from the sect Yen." The middle-aged cultivator was stunned and said in disbelief, "How is this possible? We don't even know where we are. After we entered the world, we did not come into contact with anyone from the sect Yen. Why would they come here?" The old man said, "I just have a hunch. Perhaps they have also predicted that a heavenly saint will be born here." When the middle-aged cultivator wanted to say something, a disciple came to him and reported, "Elder E, the disciple who went to scout saw a native village in front of us." The old man did not reply immediately. Instead, he calculated for a moment and said, "Although those cultivators are quite far away from us, if they are really from the Yen school, then they are definitely coming for us. Send the order to all disciples to hurry to the village as soon as possible." The middle-aged cultivator was shocked. He bowed and urged everyone to speed up their journey. When the first light of dawn appeared on the second day, everyone rushed outside the village, only to find that it was unexpectedly large. There were at least a few thousand people here. They didn't know how so many people could survive in such a harsh environment. However, when they saw the bones of ferocious beasts hanging everywhere in the village and the villagers dealing with their internal organs and flesh, they could understand a little. The people in the village seemed to be surprised that the Luo denomination's group came from the desert. However, they were very friendly. Not only did they treat them with good meat and wine, they even gave them their stone houses. The old man ordered his subordinates to give them some pills and weapons in return. Then he stayed in the most spacious stone house. After the middle-aged cultivator looked around, he came back and reported, "Elder E, these villagers are not simple. Even without using weapons, they can fight lions and tigers." The old man nodded and said, "Being able to survive here is naturally not simple. The heavenly saint might have been born here. Go and ask around and see if there are any children born here." The middle-aged man obeyed. After half a day, he came back and reported that 3 days ago, a family in the east of the village gave birth to a child. When the child was born, he was shrouded in light and was very extraordinary. The old man's spirit was shaken. 3 days ago was exactly when they had arrived. He took out a painting of a demon god from his bosom and opened it to take a look. The demon god's finger had been pointing to the east, and he immediately realized that this child might very well be the person they were looking for. He said, "Take this child away. We will leave after noon and leave this place as soon as possible." The middle-aged cultivator said yes and retreated. Not long after, The sound of weapons clashing and shouting could be heard from outside. Then, it gradually subsided. After about 15 minutes, the middle-aged cultivator returned to the stone house with a sleeping baby in his arms. The old man's eyes lit up. He took the child in his arms and felt as if he was hugging a piece of warm jade. He said, as expected of the heavenly saint, "The prosperity of the Luo denomination depends on this child." He asked again, "How was it?" The middle-aged cultivator said, "The people in this village refused to let us take the child away. They were also unwilling to join the Luo denomination. I could only take him away by force." The old man looked at him. There was no joy or anger on his face. He said, "In that case, we need to clean up the mess. Don't leave any traces." The middle-aged cultivator said, "Don't worry, elder." Although the villagers could fight and kill monsters, they were defenseless against the Luo denomination who were proficient in spells. In just a moment, they were all slaughtered. The old man walked out with the baby in his arms. Then, the group hurriedly left the place. In order not to leave any clues, they cast a spell to sink the entire village into the ground before they left. About half a day later, a flying boat arrived. Tang Yu stood at the bow of the boat and took a look. He took out a mirror and looked at it. He sneered and drove the flying boat towards the direction where the Luo sect and the others had left. Chapter 2191. Tang Yu came to this domain because there was a message on the Dharma inheritance stone tablet that there was a baby that was about to be born. He was a person favored by heaven and earth and was extremely important to Yen sect. If he could be taken into Yen sect, then the sect would definitely prosper in the future. In reality, with his current ability, it was really overkill to do this. If it wasn't for Gao Chengtu's special attention to this baby, he would not have been sent here to prevent any mistakes. It was just that after coming here, he saw that the place where the baby was born had been razed to the ground. Looking at the residual aura, the person who did it was most likely from his old rival Luo sect. However, after thinking about it carefully, since this baby was favored by heaven and earth, he would not die here so easily. It was very likely that he was taken away by the Luo sect. Not long after the flying boat flew, Tang Yu discovered that there were spots of green around him. It was obvious that they were out of the desert. The sandstorm had also become much weaker. He glanced down. Although the Luo sect people had used some kind of concealment, but under his gaze, there were still faint traces left. He could see that these people were divided into 3 groups, each going in a different direction. There were more people and fewer people, so it was difficult to determine where the baby landed. He turned around and pointed out 3 capable disciples from the group behind him, saying, "I'll leave this matter to you. Go search in one place each. Even if you can't eliminate this group of people, try your best to delay them. I will send people over to help." The 3 disciples bowed and flew out of the flying boat, each going in a different direction. One of the disciples with the surname Chen flew out for half a day and saw the Luo sect people. There were about 50 people. After leaving the wilderness, without the interference of the sandstorm, they were all flying in the clouds. Although the other party had a large number of people, he was not afraid and immediately rushed up. At the same time, he made a hand sign, and as his mana revolved, streams of flowing light and flames rushed towards this person. Today's Yen sect was different from the past. He was proficient in all kinds of supernatural Taoist techniques and could also control all kinds of flying boats and magical weapons. His combat power was far from what it used to be. This was also the reason why he dared to attack alone. Moreover, he did not expect to take care of these people by himself. This move was mainly to entangle this person and wait for the arrival of reinforcements. As for whether he would be able to injure the infant, he wasn't worried in the slightest. A person that obtained the favor of the heavens and the earth naturally possessed karmic luck, so it wouldn't be so easy for the infant to be killed by him. Elder E from the Luo denomination did not travel with the crowd. He was cautious and carried the baby alone. He concealed his figure and flew at a low altitude. At this moment, when he saw someone chasing after him, he could tell that it was someone from the Yen denomination. Moreover, his combat power was not weak. He immediately felt that something was wrong. It was impossible for Yan Jiao to come alone. There must be even more members who had yet to arrive. After weighing the pros and cons in his heart, he immediately took out a spell and decisively left all the members behind. He quietly escaped underground. Anyway, the disciples of the Luo denomination could cultivate as long as they worshipped the statue of the demon god. Moreover, these people were not related to him, so it did not matter to him whether they lived or died. Now, as long as he could protect the heavenly saint, then he could become the person who revitalized the Luo denomination. The disciple with the surname Chen was initially afraid of the other party's numbers and was more careful. However, after exchanging blows, he realized that the other party's abilities were unexpectedly weak. In merely an hour, he had finished off all of them, but he did not find the whereabouts of the infant. He initially thought that the infant might have fallen into one of the other two paths. However, after interrogating the disciples of the Luo denomination who were heavily injured but not dead, he found out that the infant had been taken away by an elder of the Luo denomination. He quickly searched everywhere, but until nightfall, he still did not find any clues. In his frustration, he could only turn back to the flying boat. Actually, it wasn't that disciple Chen didn't work hard this time. Elder Yi had escaped for over 1,000 miles in one go, and his transcendence energy was slightly insufficient. He wanted to return to the surface, but he crashed into an underground river, and from there he escaped underground. He thought that heaven would never bar one's way. As a cultivator, it was difficult for others to deduce his origins. This underground was a natural hiding place, so he simply hid here. However, at this moment, the infant started crying. Although Elder Yi had never taken care of an infant before, it was not difficult for him to know that the infant was hungry. He was afraid that he would injure the child while escaping just now, so he scanned the infant with his eyes and examined him carefully. He was shocked and praised, as expected of a heavenly saint. This infant was blessed by nature. Although it had not been long since he was born, his muscles and bones were strong and his vitality was full. He suspected that even if he were to be left in the wilderness, he would only need a little water vapor and tiny creatures to survive for 10 days to half a month. However, he still saw this infant as the hope of the Luo denomination's revival. He was afraid that doing so would damage his foundation, so he felt that it was better to take care of him carefully. He took out a pill from his pocket and crushed it. He then used water to wrap a thick layer of medicinal paste in it and spread it on his finger to feed the infant slowly. This pill was, after all, full of medicinal effect. After the infant sucked a few mouthfuls, his short limbs moved a few times, and his body twisted a little before he fell asleep. Elder Yi did not dare to stay in one place for too long. As a cultivator himself, it was unlikely that his whereabouts would be deduced. However, the infant in his arms was not, so he could only try his best to avoid detection. Disciple Chen had already returned to the flying boat that came to pick him up. He said to Tang Yu in shame, "Master, I am useless. I let a Luo denomination elder take him away." However, Tang Yu did not reprimand him. He said nonchalantly, "It's all right. As long as he cannot leave this place, where else can he go?" He looked around and said to the disciples who had returned one after another, "I will leave this matter to you all. If you can't do it, I will let the headquarters send someone else to take over." Disciple Chen was holding back his anger. He said loudly, "Don't worry, master. Give me 100 days and I will definitely find him." Tang Yu waved his hand and said, "Don't be too sure. We have plenty of time this time. We can take our time to search. As long as we find him, everything will be fine." Actually, he left these matters to his disciples. Firstly, he had the goal of training his disciples. Another consideration was that he instinctively felt that he could not be too deeply involved with this child favored by heaven and earth. If it was not for Gao Qingtu's orders, he actually did not want to come here. After the disciples received his orders, they searched everywhere for Elder Yi. Finally, they found his whereabouts after half a year. Elder Yi was only one person. These disciples all had the same level of cultivation as him. If he had abandoned the infant, he could have hidden himself. However, he had long regarded the infant as the hope of revitalizing the Luo denomination. How could he abandon him so easily? Once he left a trace, it would immediately be deduced by the people of Yen denomination. He was killed by a few disciples of Yen denomination. Before he died, he even thought of killing the child to prevent Yen denomination from taking advantage of him. However, he could not find the opportunity until the end. On the flying boat, the disciple surnamed Chin brought the child back. He raised him in front of Tang Yu and said, "I'm afraid the denomination is looking for this child." Tang Yu looked over. This child was clearly only around 6 months old. He was already as big as a 3 or 4-year-old child. His hands and feet were waving about. His face was full of anger. He was still shouting incessantly, "You guys harmed Grandpa. Shu will kill you all." Tang Yu's face was indifferent. He waved his hand and signaled for the child to be taken away. Another half a month later, the group returned to the headquarters of Yen denomination. Tang Yu personally brought the child to Gao Chengtu. Ever since Xing arrived, he had not uttered a word. However, his eyes were full of hatred. After Gao Chengtu saw him, he ordered people to bring him away and take good care of him. Tang Yu said, "Teacher, this child is evil and tyrannical. He sees Yen denomination as an enemy. If we keep him, I'm afraid he will become a great disaster." What's funny is that he does not hate the enemy who killed his parents' clan. Instead, he recognizes the enemy as his father. If I tell him clearly, he will think that I intentionally deceived him. Gao Chengtu shook his head and said, "Why are you bickering with a half-year-old child?" Tang Yu sneered and said, "A person favored by the heavens cannot be compared to an ordinary child. I don't believe that he can help Yen denomination. In my opinion, we absolutely cannot impart Tao techniques to him. Otherwise, he will harm our denomination in the future." Gao Chengtu was not a person who could not listen to opinions. He pondered for a moment and said, "This child should be raised by me personally. If his temperament does not change, I will naturally not impart Tao techniques to him. My denomination does not lack such a person. Let him be a peaceful and stable mortal for the rest of his life." Tang Yu said, "Since teacher has said so, then disciple will obey." However, this child was brought back by disciple. If he does anything to harm Yen denomination in the future, then disciple must personally end him. In Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan was performing a spell and calculating. After deep consideration, he decided to first try to invite back the great virtue who had transmitted his thoughts to him and told him how to reach the 3rd stage of the realm. This was a choice made when there was no other choice. He had no way of knowing what the other great virtues were like, but at least this one did not have any hostile or malicious thoughts. Since a great virtue had to come back eventually, it was better to have this person. However, he used the remnant thoughts in the divine decree to search, but there was no way to find a trace of this person's Weili, which made him slightly surprised. The reason for this was either because this person's mighty energy was on par with the grand underworld founding ancestor, so he was unable to sense it, or he was firmly obstructed by the tribulation energy and didn't have a trace of his mighty energy on the outside. The last reason was that his mighty energy had vanished a long time ago. If it was like that, then he'd fallen into eternal silence. However, this possibility was not high because all great virtues had the fortune of Pauline in their hands, which could protect themselves. Not to say that they could defeat anyone, but it should not be difficult for them to protect themselves, unless they were besieged by many people of the same generation. However, if that was the case, then they would definitely not be able to keep the Pauline in their hands. However, with the help of this person's aura, he was able to find Pauline, which meant that the treasure was still in his hands in the end. Combined with the shattered thoughts, it was very likely that this person had been blocked by the power of calamity. Perhaps this person was among the great virtues who had comprehended the essence of creation. If that was the case, then it was all the more reason to bring him back. Perhaps he could understand the specific situation at that time from this person's mouth. He pondered for a moment. It seemed like he could only first dissolve the power of calamity in Pauline and allow this consciousness figure to recover completely before thinking about anything else. Chapter 2192. Zhang Yan sat in the hall with his eyes down. Xian Qi surged around him and the five-colored brilliance flowed behind him as if he was embracing the great Tao. In front of him, the creation Pauline slowly rotated. One could see that the tribulation power was like filthy mud, undulating and mixing in the transparent lotus petals and lotus seat. To dissolve the tribulation power, it was to use his Wei-Li to resist it and turn it into nothing. This tribulation power could suppress the great virtue, so it was obvious that its level was extremely high. Even with his ability, he could only wear it down bit by bit. The trouble was that this power was endless. Even if there was only one strand left, as long as he withdrew his Wei-Li, it would be full again. Therefore, once he started, he couldn't stop and had to wear it down in one go. Otherwise, all his previous efforts would be wasted. Fortunately, there was creation Pauline. During the refining process, this power wouldn't leak out at all. Otherwise, not only would the tribulation power rise again like a rising tide, everyone would also suffer the tribulation. In the blink of an eye, 100 days passed. Under his full suppression, the tribulation power was finally worn down. However, when the next great virtue returned, there would presumably be tribulation power leaking out again. At that time, he would need to resolve it again. However, at that time, he wouldn't need to be like facing a great enemy like now. Because even if he didn't make a move, Wei Ming wouldn't sit by and watch everything collapse. At this moment, he held up Pauline. Once the filthy and turbid power was removed, the object became crystal clear and flawless. It was obvious that he could try to receive that person. With a turn of his mind, he entered the divine decree. In a flash, the figure of the Taoist appeared. He still had the same tattered appearance. He pushed the treasured lotus of good fortune forward. The petals of the lotus bloomed, and wisps of golden light appeared. Wherever the light shone, the wounds on the Taoist's body were filled up, and the Taoist's body quickly recovered. At this moment, the Taoist raised his eyes and bowed to Zhang Yan. I didn't expect Taoist friend to help me perfect my spirit. I must thank you. Zhang Yan returned the courtesy and said, You don't have to thank me, fellow Taoist. I received fellow Taoist divine will that day, and just now I have seen the true face of the great Tao. What I did was just to repay you. Moreover, fellow Taoist divine will has only condensed now, and your true Wei-Li body has yet to return. This is nothing. He did not ask for the person's name. The name of Dada represented the person himself. The person in front of him was only a strand of the spirit, not the whole thing. Therefore, even if he asked, the person would not be able to tell him his Tao name. The Taoist pondered for a moment and said, From what fellow Taoist said, you seem to want to call back my lost power? Zhang Yan nodded and said, I do have this thought, but I still have to ask fellow Taoist about this matter. If fellow Taoist feels that it's inappropriate, then I will naturally not interfere. The Taoist straightened his body, raised his hand and bowed. He said with extreme seriousness, Fellow Taoist, you must not call me back. Zhang Yan, oh? Why is that? The Taoist was silent for a moment and said, This is related to the destruction of the creation essence. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. This was actually what he wanted to know. If he could understand the truth, then he would be able to weigh the pros and cons of his actions. He said, What exactly happened back then? I know very little. After I succeeded, I could sense a little, but it's hard to see the whole picture. Fellow Taoist seems to know the inside story. I wonder if you can tell me? The Taoist said, There's nothing that I can't say. Fellow Taoist will know about it sooner or later. It's just that my strand of spirit only knows the general idea. There might be some mistakes here, and some might not be true or false. Even if fellow Taoist hears it, you should still be cautious. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The Taoist said, Back then, a group of virtuous ones wanted to improve themselves, but they set their eyes on the creation essence. However, this thing transcends existence, it's hard to see the profoundness and it's flawless. Therefore, a virtuous one suggested that since we can't see the Tao inside, why don't we let the creation essence tell us? When Zhang Yan heard this, his eyes narrowed. He thought of many things in an instant. The Taoist continued, The virtuous ones accepted this suggestion, so they worked together to bestow the creation essence with its spirit consciousness. If it could awaken, it could tell us what the wonderful Tao is. At this point his voice became solemn. In the end, this action was indeed to draw out a spirit from the creation essence. Once this spirit is out, its ability will be above everyone else. However, I want to see its Tao, and it also wants to see my Tao. What I lack is what it has, and what I have is what it lacks. If it exists, I won't exist. Therefore, between me and it, there's only opposition, no harmony. Zhang Yan asked, then, did the great change in the end happen because of this? The Taoist shook his head. Perhaps it has something to do with this. My body's consciousness is broken, so I don't know how the creation essence broke. After all, this thing coexists with the Tao. Even if the virtuous ones and the spirit of creation took action, they wouldn't be able to move it at all. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, then, what does this have to do with me summoning fellow Taoists to return Weili? The Taoist said in a deep voice, I don't know why a strand of my spirit awakened after the creation essence broke, but I knew many things for no reason. This should be the arrangement that my true self made in advance, so that I could pass on these things to the people who came later. It's just that I was initially trapped in the power of robbery, so I couldn't come into being. Later on, it seemed that the power of Pauline of creation collided, causing the power of robbery to loosen. Only then was I able to break out of the confinement, and was accepted by fellow Taoist. Zhang Yan looked at him and said, then I'll have to ask, what do you know about the things that fellow Taoist knows? The Taoist said, the spirit of creation needs to devour the virtuous ones to replenish itself. In the calculations of my true self, after it devours a virtuous one, it is equivalent to seizing a part of the Tao. If it manifests this Tao into the world, that virtuous one can still appear. On the surface, it looks no different from before, but in reality, it is the spirit of creation. My true self suspects that some of the virtuous ones have already been devoured by him. Therefore, if fellow Taoist does this, it is very likely that you will attract him out. There is no way to tell from here at all. Perhaps the dim light that returned earlier was entrusted by the spirit of creation. Therefore, I think that not only can we not receive the virtuous ones back, we must also find a way to stop this. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, fellow Taoist, do you suspect that the reason why you can calculate all this is that your true self has already been devoured by the spirit of creation? The Taoist bowed and said, that is exactly so. Therefore, fellow Taoist must not summon me back, otherwise, the one who falls into being may be the spirit of creation. Zhang Yan thought for a while and nodded, I understand. I will act cautiously in the future. With a wave of his sleeve, the figure of the Taoist dissipated. With another thought, he withdrew from the divine will and then began to ponder. In fact, it was not wrong to let the spirit of creation tell the various virtuous ones what the mysteries of the upper realm were. Because just as the virtuous ones were a reflection of the great Tao, since the incarnation of the spirit of creation was bestowed by the virtuous ones, then logically speaking, it could not surpass the virtuous ones by too much. Perhaps it was also because of this that the various virtuous ones dared to do so. Because no matter who the opponent was, they had the confidence to subdue them. Moreover, the spirit refinement cultivators understood the mysteries of the great Tao. At the beginning, it all started from fighting each other. Fighting was both a confrontation and an exchange. Even if they really fought, they could see things from their opponents that they did not know. It was just that they did not know what happened later that caused the spirit of creation to collapse. In the great Tao galaxy, he had once sensed that there was another force outside of the virtuous Weili. This was probably the Weili that the spirit of creation possessed. According to the Taoist, the next one to return might be this one, and the purple-robed Taoist who called himself a virtuous one was very likely to be the incarnation of the Weili that leaked out from this person. However, there was one thing that needed to be confirmed here, and that was that everything that the Taoist divine will knew was indeed transmitted by his original body. What if the transmission was not from his own will, but was instead arranged by the spirit of creation? This was also possible. However, he did not need to care about this, because now the two forces were trying to break through into the All-You, and he had no way to stop them. With his current Whaley, it was not that he could not delay this matter a little, but it could not last for a long time, so it was meaningless to do so. Thinking of this, he changed his mind. Since the Taoist was not willing to return, then his original plan had to be changed. Since he could not receive the person who had a pact with his family, then he would find a way to prevent the return of his enemy. Ji Zhuang's qi dynamic was in the hands of the purple-robed Taoist, so it could be that person who had returned, so he had to eliminate this possibility. After making this decision, he raised his finger and pointed. Ji Zhuang's qi dynamic, which was originally immersed in the purple-robed Taoist Pauline, was suddenly disturbed. This kind of reception would still be sensed by the virtuous ones, but the person who returned would not be Jizhuang Daoren. The purple-robed Taoist did not know this, and was still working hard. Zhang Yan did not care about him, retracted his gaze, and thought about the matter at hand. The incarnation of the will, Yan Weiming, could also be the spirit of creation, but this possibility was not high. The spirit of creation could fight against the virtuous ones, so the Whaley must be extremely high. When it fell into the all-beings, it should not only release such a small amount of robbery power, unless it was like Ji Zhuang, Yao Han, and the others, and only a portion of its power returned first. He actually hoped that this was the case, because if this person really did so, then not only would it give the opponent a chance to eliminate it, but if he fought with it, it would be easier for him to see the upper realm of the great Tao. So normally, the spirit of creation should be the last to return, and by that time, it was likely that all the virtuous ones would have returned to the all-beings, so he would not be the only one fighting against it. And after eliminating this, there was still one possibility. His gaze suddenly became deep. As Bu Su Tianyu master, after several attempts of comprehension, his understanding of the essence of creation was not shallow, so he had a deduction. The spirit of creation entrusted the essence of creation, and no matter what caused it, the essence of creation was broken, and it was likely to become incomplete. The part that was still trapped by the robbery power might only be a larger part of the power, and the smaller part might have accompanied the broken essence of creation and distributed among the all-beings, and the place where Bu Su Tian's essence of creation was most condensed might have his spirit residing within. Chapter 2193. Zhang Yan privately deduced that every land of creation should have a broken spirit of creation. However, due to the amount of spirit of creation, there were also big and small differences in the amount of spirit of creation. On the other hand, there was no need to care about the fragment of creation. Since it was so fragmented, once a spirit refinement cultivator found it, they would either refine it or take it to comprehend it. Even if there really was a spirit of creation inside, it would be extremely weak and almost negligible. In reality, even a land of creation with a weaker foundation could be invaded by the great virtue Whaley, so the threat was not that great. However, since he already knew about it, he could not let it go so easily. He looked at the land of creation under his rule one by one. At first, there was nothing unusual, but now that he paid special attention, he found some flaws. This was not because he was careless before, but at the level of the transformation of existence and non-existence. If you knew about it, then it existed. If you didn't know about it, then it didn't. In reality, there was almost nothing that could not be known by the great virtue. Only an existence like the spirit of creation could be hidden from him just now. These flaws were like spots on a bright and clean piece of jade. The more he looked at it, the more obvious it became. However, they were attached to the land of creation and did not appear in the world. They were connected to the land of creation. As long as the land of creation was not destroyed, they would not disappear. It was just that no one knew when they would appear. However, since he had already set his eyes on them, they would not be a disaster. He could destroy their appearance in the world at any time and force them back into silence. After looking at these lands, he turned his gaze back to Busha Heaven. Previously, there was a unique spirit that was born here, and this one's appearance was very coincidental. It was neither too early nor too late, so it was hard to say if it was related to the spirit of creation. Hence, he decided to do some screening. Logically speaking, if there was a problem with the person, it would be impossible to hide it from a Vedanta like him. However, the spirit of creation's level was not below the Vedantas, and was even slightly higher. Therefore, he still needed to investigate further. The Yinjiao headquarters. Light suddenly flashed above the door of 2 realms. In a breath's time, the light faded and a handsome Taoist walked out. As he walked, his eyes shone brightly. This person was the child who was saved from the hands of the Luo sect elder. Now, his Taoist name was clear. Seeing him come out, the 2 disciples guarding the realm gate on the altar hurriedly bowed and stepped aside. Qing Bian turned a blind eye to the 2 of them. With a tap of his foot, he soared into the sky and flew straight towards the main hall. One of the disciples that guarded the altar looked at the fleeing light and said with slight envy, "I heard that Protector Qing Bian conquered another world that was hostile to my evolution sect, causing all the living beings there to submit to my evolution sect. Now that he's back, I presume he's going to be promoted to a protector." Another disciple laughed and said, "What's so great about being a protector? Who knows, he might even be the sect leader in the future." The previous disciple glared at him and said, "Don't talk nonsense. This isn't something we can discuss." When Qing Bian was taken into the evolution sect, although he kept saying that he wanted to take revenge, he was still a child after all and didn't know much. When he grew older, he would naturally be able to distinguish between cause and effect. He even specially made a trip back to his homeland to find out the truth. He understood that the person who took care of him was actually the enemy who exterminated his family. He was gifted and his cultivation was extremely fast. In less than 100 years, he had already reached the level of Yuanying, far surpassing his peers. As early as 15 years ago, he had already become a protector of the evolution sect and cleaned up the remnants of the Luo sect and the dissect that were left in the various worlds. Because he was decisive in doing things and had never failed, his reputation was growing day by day. The higher-ups of the sect all said that the next sect leader might be chosen between him and Tang Yu. The main hall of the evolution sect was not far from the door of 2 realms. It didn't take long for Qing Bian to land in front of the hall. After reporting, he was called in. After entering the inner room, he bowed to Gao Qingtu and said, "Greetings, teacher." Gao Qingtu smiled and said, "You're back. Did the trip go smoothly?" Qing Bian replied, "Very smoothly. It's not like teacher doesn't know that these 2 sects actually don't have any experts. The troublesome thing is that it's too easy to cultivate. As long as one person is left, they can spread the Tao. It's very difficult to wipe them out and they can't kill them all. According to my opinion, we might as well kill all the living beings in every place we go. That way, we can eliminate all future troubles and it won't take up the energy of the evolution sect." Gao Qingtu shook his head and said, "These living beings are originally not at fault. Most of them learn Tao in order to better survive in the world. As long as they're not stubborn people, it's best if they're willing to change and worship our evolution sect. If they're unwilling, as long as they don't cultivate the original Tao, then let them be. There's no need to be too harsh on them." When Qing Bian heard this, he raised his head and said loudly, "Disciple doesn't agree with teacher's words. As the saying goes, human desires are boundless." How can these people who have learned Tao be willing to be mediocre? Especially those who burn, kill, and loot. After they've tasted the sweetness, they can't return to the past. The sun and moon can change, but it's hard to change a person's heart. Our evolution sect absolutely can't let these people mix in. We must use thunderous methods to eliminate them. Only then can we get rid of them once and for all. Gao Qingtu sighed inwardly. Every protector under the evolution sect had their own way of doing things. He wouldn't deliberately interfere either. Qing Bian's radical and unyielding method was rather similar to Tang Yu's. It was just that the 2 of them never really got along with each other. He didn't comment on these matters anymore. He glanced at Qing Bian and said, "Your cultivation has improved again?" Qing Bian said, "Yes, disciple feels that our evolution sect's great enemies are everywhere. Therefore, I've been speeding up my cultivation recently, hoping to make more achievements in the future." Gao Qingtu exhorted, "Your cultivation has advanced too quickly, but it's inevitable that your temperament is unstable. It's time for you to stop and properly cultivate your mind." Qing Bian didn't know how many times he had heard these words. He felt somewhat impatient in his heart. He had never felt that something like temperament was of any use. There had never been such an obstacle in the process of his cultivation. All the difficulties were leaped over in one leap. However, he still respectfully agreed on the surface. Looking at Qing Bian's appearance, Gao Qingtu knew that Qing Bian didn't listen. He sighed, waved his hand and said, "You may leave." Qing Xian uttered a yes, bowed, turned around, and walked out in large strides. Gao Qingtu stood up and came before a huge stone screen with the portraits of the protectors of the evolution sect engraved on it. His gaze lingered on it for a long time. Recently, his cultivation had gradually increased. He felt that his cultivation might have broken through again. Originally, he had the intention to go into closed-door training. However, he needed to find a trustworthy person to entrust the affairs of the sect to. There were 3 choices here. The first was Tang Yu, the second was Gao Gua, and the third was Qing Bian. Each of the 3 had their own advantages and disadvantages. Tang Yu was decisive in his actions and knew his limits. Moreover, his seniority was also sufficient. However, he thought highly of himself and didn't have a harmonious relationship with his fellow disciples. It was difficult for him to convince them. Gao Gua had a simple and honest temperament. He carried out the tasks given by him meticulously. However, his shortcoming was that he was inflexible and didn't know how to be flexible. As for Qing Bian, he completely relied on his innate talent to cultivate. Moreover, it didn't take much effort. If he truly focused on the path of Tao, his achievements would be far more than that. He appeared to be amiable on the surface, but there was a vicious aura in his heart that had never been resolved. He still needed to polish it for a few more years. After thinking about it, he had already made a decision. There were no major events in the surroundings. He only needed to calm things down. It would be fine as long as there was someone who could stabilize the situation. When he came out of closed-door training, he could arrange other matters. Thus, he instructed the boy beside him, "Summon Gao Gua." In the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan retracted his gaze. Just now, he looked at Qing Bian's world and observed all of its past and future, as well as the changes of the cycles of the worlds. He confirmed that it was indeed formed purely from the qi of creation and had nothing to do with the spirit of creation. In fact, even if it was somewhat related to the spirit of creation, it wouldn't be a big problem. This was because Qing Bian now recognized himself as a disciple of the Yen order from the bottom of his heart. Other than the fact that his temperament still needed to be polished, there wasn't much of a problem. If he handled it well, he could even make use of it. He could indeed promote the prosperity of the Yen order. In reality, the spirit of creation might not necessarily be harmful. Because it had already become a separate entity, its actions might not necessarily be in line with the original spirit of creation's will. Just like Wei Ming's avatar that was entrusted with his will, after his consciousness was cut out, he didn't want to go back no matter what. Furthermore, he could even use these broken spirit of creation to deal with himself. His gaze shifted to another place. There was indeed a spirit of creation in Bu Su Tian, and this person could be considered an acquaintance. He summoned Jing Yu and said, "Go to the lower realm and invite fellow Taoist Dan Yi here." Jing Yu bowed and left to obey the order. Zhang Yan's eyelids drooped as he sat on the jade platform without moving. Not long after, the formation spirit in the hall came up and reported, "Master, Dan Yi and Yuan Zun have arrived outside the hall." Zhang Yan, invite him into the hall. After a while, Dan Yi came into the hall and bowed. "Fellow Taoist, is there something you need from me?" Zhang Yan looked at him and said politely, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi, please sit down and talk." Dan Yi bowed again and sat down on the seat. Zhang Yan said slowly, "I remember that fellow Taoist once told me that you don't remember where you came from?" Dan Yi said, "That is indeed the case. My memories of the past seem to have been lost. No matter how I search, it is difficult to find them." He paused for a moment, looked up and said, "Fellow Taoist asked about this. Is there something wrong with my past?" Zhang Yan, "Not long ago, I discussed a mystery with a fellow Taoist. Because it involved a great theurgy, I couldn't tell you the specifics in front of you. This great theurgy's ability is above us. His true body is not within the myriad heavens and realms, but his broken avatar is roaming the world. At this point he stopped talking. Danny said, "In that case, I am the broken avatar of that great theurgy?" Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Danny was silent for a moment, then said, "Is this great theurgy an enemy of fellow Taoist?" Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said, "There is no such thing as friend or foe, it is just a battle of the great Tao." Danny pondered for a moment, then stood up and bowed. He said seriously, "If this body of mine is a hindrance to fellow Taoist, I am willing to listen to fellow Taoist judgment. Right now, in this Busu heaven, Dan Yi can't be without fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan also stood up and looked at Danny. He said, "I still remember that when fellow Taoists came to find me, you went back and forth for the protection of the great Tao, connecting with other Taoists. Just now, we can expel a group of Khanate demons from Busu heaven. I just want to ask, fellow Taoist, do you still think that you are a person of the great Tao?" Danny said without hesitation, "Of course. Although I don't remember many things, I still remember that a great theurgy of the great Tao took care of me. It was him who taught me many truths and understood all things in the world. He was like my teacher, like my father. As long as I am alive, I am a person of the great Tao." Zhang Yan looked at him and smiled. He said, "Fellow Taoist, you can go back now." Danny was surprised and looked over in confusion. He said, "Fellow Taoist this?" Zhang Yan looked over and said, "Fellow Taoist is a fellow Taoist, and that person is that person. The two can't be confused. Since fellow Taoist agrees with my human path, then you're naturally a member of my human path. Why should I make things difficult for you? Even if that great theurgy comes looking for me, there will be I to deal with it." Chapter 2194. After Zhang Yan sent Danny away, he was also thinking that rather than waiting for the spirits of creation that were immersed in various domains to show themselves, it would be better to lure them out in advance. After this generation entered the world, because they were independent individuals, they were like a blank piece of paper. He could find a way to make them recognize humanity like Dan Yi and hate their original identities. If he could do that, he wouldn't have to use this generation to fight against the spirits of creation outside of all beings. As long as they didn't stand against him and not be used by the latter, it would be enough. This kind of calculation could be put aside for now. There was a matter that needed to be considered first. He looked at a certain land of creation that was occupied by Wei Ming. Was this person the body that the spirits of creation resided in? If this person was really the incarnation of the spirits of creation, then did he know his original appearance? This matter had to be confirmed. However, the relationship between him and Wei Ming was only harmonious on the surface. He had never let down his guard. If they were to fight, although this person's strength was not as good as his, if the person wanted to escape, he might not be able to take him down in a short period of time. Therefore, if there was really a problem with the latter, he could at most restrict this person from continuing to search for the land of creation. Only when a great virtue returned and joined forces with him could it be possible to force this person into silence. With a thought, a Wei surged and turned into a clone. It came out of Bu Su Tian and landed in front of a land of creation in an instant. He bowed and said, "Is fellow Taoist Wei Ming here?" Wei Ming was currently searching for the land of creation. Seeing that Zhang Yan had come to him, he felt a little strange. He didn't know why the latter came to find him at this time. He calculated for a while and saw that there were no signs of danger. He came out of the place and greeted Zhang Yan first before asking, "Fellow Taoist, why are you here?" Zhang Yan said, "This time I came here to confirm something with fellow Taoist." Wei Ming was slightly surprised and said, "What is it?" Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist once said that after the spirit of creation was broken, part of the power was still trapped outside of all beings due to the power of calamity. As a result, many things are not known." Wei Ming looked at him and said, "Since fellow Taoist asked this, do you know something?" Zhang Yan said, "I saw a trace of heaven's secret in meditation. It just so happens that Taoist doesn't know about it." What he said was not wrong. Because the Taoist's psyche was gathered and saw all of this in his own spirit, so it could be said that it was deduced by him. Wei Ming understood and said, "There must be something important here that concerns our Tao. Otherwise, fellow Taoist wouldn't have come to me." He looked up and said, "If fellow Taoist sees anything, please don't hesitate to tell me." Zhang Yen said, "Taoist of the great Tao, in order to find the Taoist Tao is the spirit, you wanted to awaken of Taoist of creation, so had would Taoist to seek the spirit of Tao. To in of the spirit of Tao. Dan of Tian. To say." A strange light flashed in Wei Ming's eyes and he said slowly, "Where is the spirit of creation now?" Zhang Yen said, "Fellow Taoist, you can see some clues when you look at the land of creation under your rule." Wei Ming looked back and after a while, his eyes narrowed and he said, He actually saw a trace of a spot here. It was very eye-catching, but he didn't notice it at all before. As a great Tao, he naturally understood the Tao of being and non-being. Before he knew about this, he couldn't see this thing. But after knowing about it, he could see it. Zhang Yen said, "The spirit of creation that Taoists saw is just a fragment. Nowadays, it can be seen in most of the land of creation. However, the biggest part of it is still outside of being. It can swallow the great Tao, occupy their Tao, and then appear with their appearance. Even if you are familiar with the same Taoist, you won't be able to distinguish it." Wei Ming looked at him and said in a deep voice, "I know what Taoist wants to say, but Taoist might have misunderstood." Zhang Yen said calmly, "Can Taoist really distinguish yourself?" Wei Ming frowned. Originally, this question wasn't difficult for Great Tao. Great Tao and Tao were mixed together, and it was the manifestation of the Taoist in the world. Tao was me and I was Tao. How could I be replaced by others? However, the spirit of creation could do this, and he couldn't prove himself. He pondered for a moment and said, "According to what fellow Taoists said, the spirit of creation wants nothing more than to devour the other fellow Taoists to complete itself. However, with my strength, it seems impossible. Even fellow Taoist is unable to defeat it. If something unexpected happens and I fall into silence, then I'm afraid I won't be able to return." Zhang Yen smiled faintly and said, "That's not necessarily true. Taoist Weili, if there's no one to stop you when you return, then you will definitely destroy everything and drive those who are weaker than you into silence. At that time, you will be able to smoothly occupy Bu Su Tian. The spirit of creation was born from the essence of creation, and Bu Su Tian is a broken part of it, so it is just right for you to be compatible with it. When another great Tao comes, it will definitely return to Bu Su Tian. Then, Taoist can use the Weili to swallow it, and with the power of the two of you, you can deal with those who return later. Then, you will be able to quickly swallow all the great Tao for yourself. That way, it will be easy to achieve perfection." Wei Ming was speechless for a moment. These words made it seem like he was really the spirit of creation. If it was someone else here, they might have already fallen into self-doubt. However, as a great Tao, he naturally couldn't be shaken by a few words. Even if he had doubts about something, he would only try to verify it. No matter how possible it looked on the surface, before it really happened, he wouldn't easily deny himself. He snorted and said, "No wonder you said you couldn't tell." He paused for a moment and looked at Zhang Yen. "If you think it's inappropriate, there is actually a way to solve this matter." Zhang Yen said, "I'd like to hear the details." Wei Ming said, "If fellow Taoist has the means, you can send me into eternal silence. Then, as fellow Taoist said, you can rely on Bu Shutian's power to wipe out all the other Taoists that come later. It won't be difficult to cut off this path." Zhang Yen smiled and said, "How do you know I haven't thought about it?" Wei Ming's eyes narrowed. "Then why didn't you do that?" Zhang Yen said indifferently, "No matter what, our greatest enemy is the spirit of creation. How can there be internal strife before the enemy is eliminated? At least before I can confirm that you are the spirit of creation, I won't do that." In fact, what Wei Ming said was only a possible situation. In reality, the Vedanta and the spirit of creation were two consciousnesses pushing behind the scenes. How could he solve this matter so easily? At that time, it wouldn't be one person who returned to the world, but two or even more. At that time, he wouldn't just be the enemy of the spirit of creation, but also the Vedanta. Moreover, even if he sent the returning Vedanta into eternal silence every time, it wouldn't be of much benefit to him. He wasn't the spirit of creation who could devour the Vedanta to strengthen himself. When the spirit of creation returned in the end, it would be hard to know who would win. Wei Ming relaxed a little when he heard this. He was clearly worried that Zhang Yan would really do this. He said, "In fact, it doesn't matter even if I can't determine it. The spirit of creation will definitely want to return to the world of creation. Then, I can help you stop everyone from returning. This way, even if I am the spirit of creation, it won't affect the overall situation." He was willing to do this not only to guard against the spirit of creation, but also so that he could have more time to search for the land of creation and obtain a greater advantage before the next Vedanta came. Zhang Yan didn't comment on this and smiled. "Since you have this intention, then it is enough. I will take my leave first." He had said what he needed to say. If Wei Ming was the spirit of creation's entrustment, then he had nothing to lose. If not, then he would definitely be wary of the Vedanta who would return later. Even if it was a fellow Taoist who had a good relationship with him, he wouldn't feel at ease to be too close to the Vedanta in a situation where he couldn't make a judgment. It was even possible that he would join forces with him. He cupped his hands and waved his sleeves. His figure disappeared and his consciousness instantly returned to Bu Shutian. He then sensed the power that was constantly seeping into the world of creation and found that the heavens' secrets were constantly changing. The two powers had now produced unpredictable changes. This was also expected. After he learned of the existence of the spirit of creation, the power behind him had sensed it and naturally responded. Even if the next Vedanta came immediately, he wouldn't be surprised. However, regardless of whether the next Vedanta was the spirit of creation or not, he had to be prepared to deal with a great enemy. With the Tai Golden Bead and Bu Shutian, it wasn't foolproof. The opponent he had previously considered was the Vedanta. Even if they were to compete, it wouldn't reach the point of life and death. The spirit of creation was different. If it was stubborn in pursuing the Tao, then the Vedanta would be the resources to supplement its own Tao. The Vedanta Weili's strength usually depended on who could break through the boundaries of the great Tao and walk further. In this aspect, he didn't dare to say that he was above all the Vedanta, but he was certainly among the top. Moreover, his strength and body were combined, so when he fought, the true strength he could exert was even more tyrannical. Although the Vedanta had the Pauline of creation, it was an external object after all. It was ultimately separated from one's body and was destined to be unable to fuse with it. If the Vedanta passed away, then the Pauline in their hands could be taken away by anyone of the same generation. However, after the Vedanta's achievement, if they didn't go too far when they reached the Tao, then they could still continue to comprehend the principles after they returned, improve their mana, and find a way to make up for the loss. However, the improvement here was relatively slow, because it was ultimately not as clear as after breaking through the boundaries of the Great Tao. It was also possible for there to be no improvement after achieving it. However, Zhang Yan was different. He occupied Bu Shutian, the place where the greatest essence of creation gathered. As the preaching of Yan's sect became more widespread, many spirits of creation worshipped Yan's sect, which also gradually made up for the missing part. In the long run, this would definitely be able to promote his own understanding of the Great Tao. However, at present, it was of limited help to him. Instead, it was more useful to find more places of creation. However, aside from these, he had another idea in his mind, which was to push the body of strength to a truly perfect state, and not just as a mere sustenance for the body of qi. He had this idea in the past, but at that time, his cultivation was slightly insufficient. However, after achieving the Vedanta, he saw many secrets of the Great Tao, and felt that this path might not necessarily be impossible. Chapter 2195. Among all those who cultivated to the peak of Taoism, if they wanted to improve their strength, they had to walk the path of Tao. For example, in the way of Qi, Cultivating to the third tier of spirit refinement was breaking through the limits of the great Tao. Zhang Yan also had to do the same when he refined the Tai golden bead. Only then could he turn gold into spirit. However, this was not the only way. It was just that he had achieved great virtue through the way of qi, so this was the most convenient way to do it. He had also considered whether he could use the body of strength to break through the limits of the great Tao, but after some calculations, he found that it was not so simple. Although all methods reached the origin of the great Tao, but the path of strength was different from the way of qi. It was a completely different path. It was not as simple as breaking through the limits of the great Tao to achieve perfection. The original enlightened way comprehending divine contract had no secrets in front of him. If he wanted to, he could also create a similar method. Originally, although the enlightened way comprehending divine contract was a method of 9 tiers, and it seemed that the last tier could directly lead to the great Tao, in reality, this was impossible. However, he thought that the 9th tier might not necessarily not exist. This should be the step to connect with the Demon Lord. If he really cultivated it, he was afraid that in the end, he would lose himself and become the foundation of the world for the Demon Lord to return. From the path of the method, it could be seen that the original intention of the Demon Lord who created the enlightened way comprehending divine contract was not to pursue the Tao. It was purely to create a body for himself to return. Because the body of strength was not his own body, it was impossible to fuse with it. Therefore, if his plan really succeeded, when the day came, he would definitely abandon it. However, he was different. The body of strength was his own body to begin with. It was possible for his qi and body of strength to fuse together. Even though his body of strength was not complete, it had already brought him great benefits. However, if he did not walk the limits of the great Tao, he could only seek other methods. He thought for a moment. The body of strength was condensed from Busu's Tian Yin Weili. It was deep and reserved, and its foundation was firmly rooted in the world. It was also because of this that it could replace Creation Pauline as the foundation of the world. Thinking of this, a light lit up in his heart. Creation Pauline. His eyes flickered slightly. Perhaps the path of strength would fall on this object. Looking at the path of strength in the past, it was all about devouring external objects to refine one's own body. Before the 7th layer, one would kill demons and refine devils, then use the simplified method of subduing devils to combine the turbid yin to achieve true yang. Then one would break through the red continent, connect the positive and negative heavens and earth, and obtain an indescribable object. After one had successfully refined his spirit, he would see the face of Bu Shui Tian Weili, and then he would condense the world's seizing body. The owner of the devil treasury should have only arranged the divine contract to the step of using the mighty power of Bu Shui's heavenly yin face. As for the next step, because it was not seeking Tao, he would not waste time to deduce it. Therefore, he thought that if he wanted to perfect the body of strength, he should not only rely on the face of Bu Shui's Yin Weili, but also need to embrace other objects. Looking at everything other than the land of creation, it would be Creation Pauline. Creation Pauline, although the level of this object was not low, and could be entrusted with the great virtue Weili, and contain the power of calamity, but its own power could be divided and dispersed, and used by people. If he could refine the power of Pauline into the body of strength, he might be able to achieve such an achievement. After having a direction, he calculated in his heart, but found that there were many obstacles. If the land of creation was not bad, then Creation Pauline was not damaged. The so-called not damaged did not mean that the lotus itself could not be damaged, but that no matter where its power went, it would always exist. Even if it collapsed, it could be gathered again. As long as the owner of Pauline had enough ability, he could find all the scattered power, and would not lose a bit because it had collapsed and scattered. He could use it, but others could also take it away. Even if he could snatch all of Pauline in his hands, it did not belong to him. Also, in his deduction, he also found that in fact, although each Pauline existed alone, just like the lotus petals, only when they were gathered together could they become Pauline. Therefore, he suspected that when all Pauline was gathered together, there would be some changes, or some unpredictable power would be drawn out. Now he did not know what it was, which meant that it was still beyond his knowledge. If it was in the Great Path Galaxy, it might be closer to the source of the Great Path. If he wanted to see this power, he could only see the original creation Pauline. But this was not so easy. Even if this treasure was not as good as the original essence of creation, it was not too far off. At least, it was at the same level as the great virtue. Moreover, according to the deduction, a single creation Pauline was not enough to see the root. The Taoist in purple once said that if everything collapsed, after all Pauline was gathered in one place, it could be reopened. From this point of view, if he wanted to know the true nature of this treasure, perhaps he could only see it after destroying everything once and waiting for it to be reopened. But it was absolutely impossible for him to do this, and this kind of deduction was only a possibility. It might not be able to find what he wanted. However, there was actually another feasible method to verify this method, and that was to pluck a strand of vital energy from every single lotus before deducing it with the damaged jade. Then, there was an extremely high possibility that he would be able to see through its true appearance. And with his current ability, as long as he could see it, he would naturally have a cognition. If he succeeded, he might even be able to push his Tao to the next level. When he sorted out these, he also nodded secretly. He did not expect that this time, not only did he find the direction to advance his body of strength, but he also found a way to improve his Tao. If it weren't for the fact that he had a great enemy outside, he would have found the crux of the matter, but it would have been a long time later. Therefore, these battles weren't necessarily a bad thing. They were also the ultimate help for those who wanted to obtain the great path. Don't look at the fact that those great virtues created the spirit of creation, but they did indeed find the path to the great path through them, and it was the same for the spirit of creation. The battle between the great virtues and the spirit of creation was actually the process of continuously moving towards the great path. It was just a matter of seeing which side could walk to the end. At this moment, with the guidance of his thoughts, for creation Pauline flowers appeared in front of him. They looked the same, but in fact, they came from different sources. The most plump one was obtained from the Taoist who transmitted his thoughts. It could be said that the power was complete. 2 of them came from Ji Zhuang and Yao Han, but the absolute power was missing. The lotus petals were sparse and broken. The last Pauline flower came from the Taoist in purple who impersonated the great virtues. After the person died, the lotus also collapsed and was later reassembled by him, but there was still a part of it that fell into his hands. But the Whaley here was extremely small. It looked illusory, as if it could dissipate at any time. At that time, he intercepted this part of the power, just to prevent this Pauline from being taken by someone else. He did not expect that it would come in handy now. These 4 Pauline flowers came from different realms, and he collected a wisp of Qi dynamic from each of them. Now, it was the creation Pauline in the present world, which was also the Qi dynamic in the hand of Wei Ming, that had not been taken. She was still here, so it was not easy to do this, but there was still a chance after all. Every great virtues who returned would retrieve the Pauline that they originally possessed, and if they wanted to complete their great path, they would more or less come into conflict with those of the same Tao. At that time, he could take the opportunity to weaken the opponent and openly take the Qi of Pauline. After thinking about it, he put this long-term matter aside and turned his gaze to the front. Now, what he needed to deal with was the spirit of creation. Although the spirit of creation in the land of creation under his rule could not be completely removed, he could push it into the world. This way, not only could he use it for his own use, but it was also equivalent to exposing the hidden dangers of the land of creation to the surface. His gaze turned and first landed on the mirror lake. Under the Whaley's transmission, the filthy impurities that were attached to the land of creation wriggled, and then entered the present world. However, this kind of spirit of creation had to be watched at all times, and someone had to come forward to teach it. Otherwise, if it was not its nature, once it gained the upper hand, it would go astray. And the person who taught it could not be any random person. It also needed to be fated, otherwise, it would only have the opposite effect. He calculated in his heart, and then smiled. I did not expect these 2 to be fated. He looked at the formation spirit below and said, Summon Zhang Chan. Not long after, the formation spirit came in to report. Chan Lengjun has arrived. Zhang Yan nodded. Summon him in. When Zhang Chan arrived in the hall, he bowed to the seat and said, "This lowly one greets master." Zhang Yan smiled. "Dispense with the formalities. I called you here today because there is something I need you to do. If it was someone else, they wouldn't be able to do it." Hearing this, Zhang Chan almost floated in the air, but he didn't dare to lose his composure in the hall. He only said loudly, "If there is anything, master, just tell me." Zhang Yan flicked his finger, and a spiritual light landed between his brows. "Do you understand?" Zhang Chan was startled, and then he patted his chest. "Don't worry, master, this lowly one will do it well, I won't disappoint you." Zhang Yan nodded. "Go." Zhang Chan bowed again and left. Zhang Yan thought for a while. The mirror lake was only slightly weaker than Busu Tian, so there should be a human path almighty being guarding it. However, there was no need for the spirit refinement Grand Supreme here, just the true Yang Yuan Zun was enough. Dan Yi and the others had been guarding Busu for a long time, so he didn't plan to use it, and it wasn't appropriate to move it. Fortunately, there were still candidates here. Back then, Huan Tong, Lu Lin, Qin Chan, Emot Song, and Han Shao sacrificed their lives to deal with the innate demons. Although they were dead, their remnant energy still remained. If he could obtain the Zhou Huanyuan Jade in the future, there was a chance that they could return. However, according to Zhang Yan's arrangement, the Yuan Jade should be left to those who had a higher chance of ascending to the upper realm. Even if these people returned, they wouldn't have any hope of reaching the Great Tao, so he took the chance to compensate them, and at the same time, fill up the emptiness of the mirror lake. Thus, he pointed with his finger, and the 5 people of the Yuan Zun returned to their Dharmakaya. The moment they returned, the 4 of them had already understood the cause and effect. After looking at each other, they bowed to an unknown place, then each of them set up a camp in the mirror lake and sat down. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.